Before we begin tonight's journey, I want to ask for your help. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It truly helps the channel grow more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review makes an incredible difference for us. And if you'd like, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in. Also, if you enjoy stories like this, please consider subscribing. It means everything to us. Before we dive in, I want to give a huge thank you to Michael for suggesting this incredible story. Now, let's begin. Ananias of Damascus, the man who prayed for his enemy. Imagine receiving a command from God that makes your heart stop. Not a gentle nudge toward comfort or blessing, but a direct instruction to walk into the presence of your greatest fear. To extend your hand towards someone whose very name makes believers whisper and flee. To offer help to a man who has made it his mission to destroy everything you hold sacred. This is not a metaphor. This is not a parable meant to inspire from a safe distance. This is the true account of a man named Ananias, a follower of Christ in the first century, who heard the voice of the Lord and was asked to do the unthinkable. What happens when God asks you to help someone you are terrified of? When obedience and self-preservation collide? When faith demands you walk directly into danger, not away from it. Tonight, we explore one of the most overlooked yet profound moments in Christian history. A moment that required more courage than standing before crowds, more faith than performing miracles, more love than human nature alone could produce. This is the story of Ananias of Damascus, a quiet believer whose single act of obedience changed the trajectory of the Christian faith forever. But to understand the weight of what Ananias was asked to do, we must first understand the world he lived in, a world where following Jesus could cost you everything. Chapter 1. The World After the Resurrection. The year is approximately 35 in the Common Era. Just a few short years have passed since Jesus of Nazareth was crucified outside Jerusalem, and only slightly less time since his followers claimed he had risen from the dead. The Christian movement, as it would come to be known, was still in its infancy, fragile as morning dew and just as likely to evaporate under the heat of persecution. In the upper rooms of Jerusalem, in the homes of Antioch, in the quiet corners of Damascus, believers gathered in secret. They shared meals that looked like ordinary dinners but carried profound spiritual significance. Bread was broken with trembling hands, not just in remembrance, but with the acute awareness that this ritual could be interrupted at any moment by soldiers demanding to know what was happening behind closed doors. They prayed in hushed voices, always aware that a knock on the door could mean imprisonment or worse. The meetings happened after dark when the streets were emptier, and neighbours less likely to notice who came and went. Believers would arrive separately, careful not to draw attention. They would embrace one another with tears of relief, grateful that everyone had survived another day. They would share news of scattered brothers and sisters, of families torn apart, of friends who had disappeared into Roman prisons. They spoke of a teacher who had proclaimed love, mercy, and a kingdom not of this world, and for these teachings they were marked as dangerous. The daily life of a Christian in this era was a delicate balance of faith and fear. In the marketplace, you had to be careful not to react when someone spoke against Jesus. At family gatherings, you had to hide your new beliefs from relatives who remained loyal to traditional Judaism. You learned to recognize other believers by subtle signs, a word here, a gesture there, because open identification could mean death. The Roman authorities viewed Christians with deep suspicion. Any group that claimed allegiance to a king other than Caesar was a potential threat to order and stability. The very words Christians used in worship, calling Jesus their Lord and King, were seditious in Roman ears. The Jewish religious leaders, meanwhile, saw Christianity as a heretical sect that threatened to undermine the very foundations of their faith and tradition. These followers of Jesus claimed their crucified teacher was the promised Messiah, that he had risen from the dead, that salvation came through him alone. Such claims were blasphemous to Jewish ears, deserving of the harshest punishment. Caught between these two powerful forces, the early believers lived in constant tension, knowing that their faith could be discovered at any moment. They watched their children playing in the streets and wondered what kind of future they would have. They went to work each day not knowing if they would return home. They treasured every gathering, every shared meal, every moment of fellowship, because any meeting could be their last. But persecution was not merely an abstract threat hanging over the community like a dark cloud. It had a face, a name, a reputation that spread like wildfire through every Christian community in the region. That name was Saul of Tarsus, and he had made it his personal mission to eradicate this new faith before it could spread any further. Saul was not a random antagonist or a faceless persecutor. He was educated, brilliant, and utterly convinced that he was serving God by hunting down those who followed the way. He represented the nightmare scenario for every believer, a man who combined religious zeal with legal authority, who had both the conviction and the power to destroy the church. To the Christians, he was the embodiment of their deepest fears. To understand Ananias' story, we must first understand the man Saul was before the road to Damascus changed everything. Chapter 2. Saul's reputation. Saul of Tarsus was not born into cruelty. He was born into privilege, education, and religious devotion. Raised as a Roman citizen in the cosmopolitan city of Tarsus, he had been sent to Jerusalem to study under Gamaliel, one of the most respected teachers of Jewish law. This was an honour few received. Gamaliel was known not just for his learning, but for his wisdom and measured approach to religious disputes. To study under him was to be marked as exceptional. Saul was a Pharisee, a member of a group known for their strict interpretation of religious law and their commitment to preserving Jewish tradition. He was not content with casual observance. He pursued righteousness with an intensity that set him apart even among his peers. By every measure of his culture and faith, Saul was a success. He was zealous, passionate, and absolutely convinced of his righteousness. When he heard about the followers of Jesus claiming that their executed teacher was the Messiah, the Son of God, Saul saw blasphemy of the worst kind. He saw a threat to everything he had devoted his life to protecting. Here were people claiming that a crucified criminal, a man condemned by the Sanhedrin and executed by Rome, was the fulfillment of Jewish prophecy. They claimed he had risen from the dead, that he was divine, that faith in him was the path to salvation. To Saul, these claims were not just wrong, they were dangerous. They threatened to lead people away from the law of Moses, to corrupt Jewish faith from within. And so, with the fervour of a true believer, with the certainty of someone who knew he was on the right side of history and heaven, Saul set out to destroy this movement before it could spread. The book of Acts describes Saul's early activities with chilling clarity. He went from house to house, dragging men and women from their homes and throwing them into prison. Imagine the terror of hearing his name spoken in the night, knowing he was coming. Imagine the sound of fists pounding on your door, the shouting of soldiers, the crying of children as their parents were hauled away. Saul showed no mercy, no hesitation. Men were arrested. Women were arrested. It did not matter if you were young or old, rich or poor, healthy or sick. If you confessed Christ, you were his target. He was present at the stoning of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. A moment that should have given anyone pause. Stephen, a man known for his wisdom and his spirit-filled preaching, was dragged before the Sanhedrin on false charges. When he spoke, defending his faith with eloquence and conviction, they covered their ears and rushed at him. They dragged him outside the city and began to stone him to death. And Saul was there, holding the coats of those who carried out the execution, making sure they could move freely as they hurled rocks at Stephen's body. While the text says he approved of Stephen's death, his involvement went deeper than passive agreement. Saul was an active, driving force behind the persecution of Christians. He voted for their punishment. He pursued them relentlessly. He became the face of the opposition, the man every believer feared most. Stories spread through the Christian community. There was the family in Jerusalem whose father had been arrested while praying. The young woman who had been dragged from her wedding celebration because someone reported her faith. The elderly man who died in prison from the beatings he received during interrogation. Each story carried Saul's name. Each tragedy bore his mark. But Saul was not content to limit his activities to Jerusalem. As believers began to scatter to escape persecution, fleeing to cities like Damascus, Saul pursued them with the determination of a hunter tracking wounded prey. He went to the high priest and requested official documents, letters that would give him authority to arrest any followers of the way he found in Damascus and bring them back to Jerusalem in chains. The high priest, eager to stamp out this heretical movement, granted his request without hesitation. Damascus was approximately 135 miles from Jerusalem, a journey of several days on foot or horseback. But distance did not deter Saul. If Christians thought they could escape by fleeing the city, they were wrong. He would follow them wherever they went. He would hunt them down in every city, every village, every hiding place, until the movement was completely eradicated. News of Saul's approach spread through the Christian community in Damascus, like a cold wind cutting through warm air. The word came from travellers, from messengers, from believers who had fled Jerusalem just ahead of his arrest warrants. Saul of Tarsus was coming, and he was bringing soldiers with him. He was bringing authority. He was bringing chains. Believers who had thought themselves safe, who had fled Jerusalem hoping for refuge in Damascus, now learned that their hunter was coming for them. The relief of escape evaporated. The hope of peace dissolved. Fear returned, sharper and more immediate than ever. Families whispered prayers behind locked doors, pleading for protection. Secret meetings became even more cautious, with lookouts posted and escape routes planned. Everyone knew someone who had been arrested, beaten, or worse. Everyone had heard the stories. Everyone knew what Saul was capable of. Among those who heard the rumours was a man named Ananias. He was not famous. He had not known Jesus during his earthly ministry. He was simply one of the faithful, a quiet disciple trying to live out his beliefs in a hostile world, praying for safety, hoping that somehow the storm would pass. And he was about to receive the most challenging instruction of his life. Chapter 3. Ananias, the Ordinary Disciple. If you were to walk through the streets of first-century Damascus and ask about the most important Christians in the city, Ananias' name would not have been at the top of the list. He was not Peter, who had walked with Jesus and now led the church in Jerusalem, performing miracles and preaching to thousands. He was not John, who had witnessed the transfiguration and the empty tomb, who had leaned against Jesus at the Last Supper. Ananias was not an apostle, not a miracle worker, not a prominent teacher or leader, whose name was known throughout the region. He was, by all accounts, ordinary, and that is precisely what makes his story so powerful. The book of Acts describes Ananias simply as a disciple in Damascus, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews who lived there. This description tells us several important things. First, Ananias was integrated into his broader community. He was not isolated or sectarian. He maintained relationships with Jews who did not follow Jesus, and they respected him. His faith had not made him angry or judgmental or withdrawn. He was known for his character, his integrity, his faithfulness to God. He was the kind of believer who showed up for prayer meetings even when he was tired, who offered his home for gatherings even when it was inconvenient, who quietly supported others in their faith without drawing attention to himself. He was the man who brought food to families when the father had been arrested, who prayed with those who were afraid, who encouraged those who were wavering under the pressure of persecution. He was, in many ways, like countless Christians throughout history who will never be famous, but whose faithfulness sustains the church generation after generation. Ananias knew how to pray. This detail, mentioned almost in passing in the biblical account, reveals something essential about his character. He had cultivated a relationship with God characterized by listening as much as speaking. He did not just recite prayers or make requests. He waited in God's presence. He created space for God to speak. He had developed the spiritual sensitivity to recognize divine communication when it came. This was not something that happened overnight. It was the fruit of years of practice, of discipline, of choosing again and again to prioritize his relationship with God above other demands. Perhaps Ananias prayed early in the morning before the city awoke. finding quiet moments before the bustle of Damascus filled the streets with noise and activity. Perhaps he prayed late at night when the household was asleep, speaking to God in the darkness, sharing his fears and hopes and questions. Perhaps he prayed while he worked, his mind turned toward heaven even as his hands performed everyday tasks. Whatever his specific practices, Ananias had learned to hear God's voice. He was also humble. There is no indication in the text that Ananias sought recognition or special status within the Christian community. He did not seem to crave authority or public acknowledgement. He was content to serve quietly, to pray faithfully, to obey consistently. When others debated who was greatest or most important, Ananias was likely in the background, making sure there was enough food for everyone or helping clean up after the gathering. These qualities, often overlooked in a culture that celebrates the spectacular, were about to become the foundation for one of the most significant moments in Christian history. Because God does not always choose the prominent or the powerful. Sometimes, perhaps often, God chooses the faithful, the ones who show up day after day, the ones who listen when others are too busy talking, the ones who, despite their fears and limitations, despite their ordinary circumstances and unremarkable resumes, are willing to say yes when called. And Ananias was about to be called in the most unexpected way imaginable. As the news of Saul's approach continued to create anxiety in the Damascus Christian community, as believers debated whether to flee again or hide or simply wait and pray, Ananias continued his daily rhythm of work and prayer. He did not know that God was about to interrupt his life with an instruction that would test every aspect of his faith. He did not know that his name was about to become forever linked with one of the most dramatic conversions in human history. He simply continued being faithful, and that faithfulness had prepared him for what was coming. Chapter 4. The Vision. It came during prayer, as these things often do. Ananias was alone, perhaps in his home in a room set aside for prayer, perhaps in a quiet place where he could focus without distraction. The city of Damascus hummed with life outside, merchants calling out their wares, children playing in the streets, the sound of animals and carts and conversation filling the air. But Ananias had learned to create an inner quiet that allowed him to hear beyond the noise. He was seeking God's presence, listening for guidance, perhaps praying for protection, as news of Saul's approach continued to spread through the community. Perhaps he was praying for wisdom about whether to stay or flee. Perhaps he was simply opening his heart to God, offering the day ahead, surrendering his fears and uncertainties into divine hands. And then, cutting through every other thought, clear and unmistakable as if someone had spoken aloud in the room, he heard his name. Ananias. It was the voice of the Lord speaking directly to him. Not a vague impression that might have been his imagination. Not a feeling that could be explained away as wishful thinking or stress or hunger. This was communication so clear, so undeniable, so present, that Ananias knew immediately this was God. The voice carried weight, authority, presence. It filled the space around him, and the space within him simultaneously. This was the voice that had spoken creation into existence, that had called prophets and kings, that had guided Israel through wilderness and exile, and it was speaking to him, to Ananias, an ordinary disciple in Damascus. His response came immediately, instinctively, from years of cultivated readiness. "Here I am, Lord." 4 simple words that expressed complete availability, total openness. Whatever God wanted, Ananias was ready to listen. Whatever the instruction, he was prepared to obey. Whatever the cost, he was willing, or so he thought. The instruction came with startling specificity. God told Ananias to get up and go to the street called Straight. This was a real location in Damascus, one of the main thoroughfares that ran east to west through the city, a street lined with shops and homes, a street Ananias had walked countless times. Anyone in Damascus would have known exactly where this was. There was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. God was giving him precise directions, turn by turn, step by step. God then specified a particular house. the house of a man named Judas. Not just any house on Straight Street, but a specific residence owned by a specific person. And there, in that house, in that exact location, Ananias would find a man from Tarsus named Saul. The name hit Ananias like a physical blow. Saul. Saul of Tarsus. Saul the persecutor. Saul whose name had been spoken in hushed, fearful tones for weeks. Saul who was coming to Damascus specifically to arrest and imprison believers. Saul who had stood by while Stephen was murdered. Saul who had torn families apart and filled prisons with Christians. God even described what Ananias would encounter when he arrived, as if anticipating the questions already forming in Ananias' mind. Saul was there right now, at this very moment. He was praying. He had been fasting for 3 days, taking neither food nor water, and in a vision of his own, Saul had seen a man named Ananias coming to him and placing his hands on him so that he might regain his sight. Wait, regain his sight? What had happened to Saul? Why was he blind? Why was he praying and fasting? None of this made sense. But these questions were secondary to the main, overwhelming, terrifying reality. God was instructing Ananias to go to Saul, to approach him, to enter the same room with him, to help him, to touch him, to pray for him. The weight of this command settled over Ananias like a heavy cloak, pressing down on his shoulders, constricting his breathing. Every instinct of self-preservation screamed that this was dangerous, that this was foolish, that this could not possibly be what God meant. Every rational thought warned that this could be a trap, that Saul might be pretending to be weakened, that soldiers might be waiting to arrest anyone who came. Every bit of common sense suggested that approaching Saul of Tarsus was tantamount to walking into a lion's den, to offering yourself as a sacrifice, to choosing death over life. The room suddenly felt smaller, the air felt thinner. Ananias' heart raced in his chest. His hands trembled, his mind spun with questions and fears and objections. This could not be right. This could not be what God was actually asking. There had to be some mistake, some misunderstanding. And yet, the instruction was clear, painfully, terrifyingly, undeniably clear. God was asking Ananias to do exactly what he feared most, not to flee from Saul, but to go to him, not to hide, but to reveal himself, not to protect himself, but to make himself vulnerable, not to curse his enemy, but to help him. Chapter 5. The honest objection. What happened next reveals something beautiful about Ananias' relationship with God, something that offers hope to every believer who has ever struggled with a difficult calling. He did not pretend courage he did not feel. He did not mask his fear with false bravado or spiritual-sounding platitudes. He did not simply obey without question, suppressing his very real concerns in an attempt to appear more faithful than he was. Instead, Ananias was honest, radically, completely, courageously honest. "Lord," he said, and we can almost hear the tremor in his voice, the tension in his words. "I have heard from many about this man, how much evil he has done to your saints in Jerusalem, and here he has authority from the chief priests to bind all who call on your name." This was not rebellion. This was not refusal. This was honest dialogue with God. Ananias was essentially saying, "Are you sure? Do you know who this man is? Do you understand the danger? Have you considered what you're asking of me?" He was bringing information to God, as if the Almighty might not have full knowledge of the situation. As if God needed to be reminded of Saul's reputation, of his activities, of his intentions in coming to Damascus. It was the kind of response that might seem presumptuous, questioning God's judgment, but it was actually deeply trusting. Ananias trusted that God could handle his honest questions. He trusted that fear was not incompatible with faith. He trusted that he could bring his whole self, including his doubts and concerns, into God's presence. Consider the courage it took to even voice this objection. Ananias was not arguing with God out of stubbornness or disobedience. He was not trying to negotiate better terms or find a loophole. He was bringing his genuine fear into the presence of the Lord. He was admitting that what was being asked of him felt impossible, terrifying, potentially fatal. He was saying, I want to obey, but I am afraid. I want to trust, but this is hard. I want to be faithful, but I need help understanding. This moment captures something essential about mature faith. Faith does not mean the absence of fear. Faith does not require pretending to be braver than we are or more confident than we feel. Faith does not demand that we suppress our questions or hide our struggles. Real faith, the kind that sustains us through the hardest moments of life, is built on honest relationship with God. It is forged in conversations where we admit we are scared, where we ask hard questions, where we wrestle with what God is asking of us. Ananias was afraid. Legitimately, reasonably afraid. Everything he knew about Saul suggested this was a death sentence. Every story he'd heard, every report that had reached Damascus, every account of Saul's persecution painted a picture of a dangerous, zealous, merciless man who would show no compassion to a follower of Christ who voluntarily walked into his presence. But Ananias did not let his fear have the final word. He brought it to God and waited to hear what God would say. He created space for a response. He did not storm out or refuse outright or demand that God change the assignment. He voiced his concern and then he listened, still open, still available, still willing to consider that God might know something he did not. And here is the remarkable thing. God did not rebuke Ananias for his fear. There was no divine anger at his hesitation, no impatience with his concern, no disappointment that Ananias was not more immediately compliant. Instead, God responded with information, with reassurance, with a glimpse into a bigger picture that Ananias could not yet see. God treated Ananias's fear not as a weakness to be condemned, but as a reality to be addressed with truth and perspective. Chapter 6. God's Greater Plan. The Lord's response to Ananias must have been stunning, completely reframing everything Ananias thought he knew about the situation. Instead of simply commanding obedience or dismissing Ananias's concerns with divine authority, God revealed something that no one in the Christian community could have anticipated, something that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. God told Ananias that Saul was not who everyone thought he was. Or rather, Saul was about to become someone entirely different. Go, the Lord said, for he is a chosen instrument of mine to carry my name before the Gentiles and kings and the children of Israel. For I will show him how much he must suffer for the sake of my name. A chosen instrument, not an enemy to be avoided, but a vessel God had specifically selected for a divine purpose. The man who had been persecuting Christians with such fervour was going to become one of Christianity's greatest advocates. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The persecutor would become the persecuted. The man who had caused so much suffering was about to learn firsthand what it meant to suffer for faith in Jesus Christ. This revelation must have shaken everything Ananias thought he understood about God's ways. How could this be possible? How could God choose Saul, of all people? What about all the believers Saul had imprisoned? What about the families he had torn apart? What about Stephen stoned to death while Saul watched approvingly? Did none of that matter? Was there no justice, no consequence? But God was revealing a different kind of justice, more profound kind of consequence. God was demonstrating that no one is beyond redemption. No past is too dark, no sin too great, no heart too hardened to be softened by divine grace. If God could transform Saul of Tarsus, then truly anyone could be redeemed. The worst persecutor could become the greatest preacher. The most violent opponent could become the most passionate advocate. The man who sought to destroy the church could become its most influential builder. God revealed to Ananias that Saul would carry the message of Jesus to the Gentiles, the non-Jewish world. This was particularly significant because the early church was still largely composed of Jewish believers. The idea that the gospel would spread beyond the Jewish community, that God's covenant would extend to all nations, was still a revolutionary concept that many struggled to accept. Some believed that Gentiles had to first become Jews, adopting Jewish customs and laws before they could truly be followers of Christ. Others questioned whether Gentiles could even be saved at all, and Saul, this educated, multilingual Roman citizen, who understood both Jewish tradition and Greco-Roman culture, who could quote the Torah and navigate Roman law, who had been shaped by both worlds, would be uniquely positioned to bridge these worlds. His background in Tarsus, his education in Jerusalem, his Roman citizenship, his Pharisaic training, all of it had been preparation, though he had not known it, for the mission God was now assigning him. But God did not paint a picture of easy success or comfortable prominence. He told Ananias that Saul would suffer. The man who had caused so much suffering would learn firsthand what it meant to be persecuted for faith. He would be beaten with rods, whipped with 39 lashes, stoned and left for dead. He would be imprisoned repeatedly, shipwrecked, abandoned by friends, betrayed by those he trusted. He would face hunger, cold, danger, and constant threats. His future path would be marked by hardship and sacrifice, and ultimately, according to later tradition, he would be martyred in Rome, executed for his faith in the very empire whose citizenship he had once relied on for protection. This detail, that Saul would suffer, was not incidental. It was central to God's plan. Saul needed to understand persecution from the inside. He needed to know what it felt like to be hunted, arrested, beaten, imprisoned. He needed to experience the fear, the pain, the isolation that he had inflicted on others. Not as punishment exactly, but as transformation. Suffering would become the crucible through which Saul's character was refined, through which his theology was deepened, through which his compassion was developed. This revelation reframed everything. Ananias was not being asked to help an enemy continue his reign of terror. He was being invited to participate in one of the most dramatic redemptions in human history. He was being given a front row seat to witness transformation that would ripple across centuries and continents. He was being asked to be the first person to welcome Saul into the family he had tried to destroy, to extend grace to someone who had shown none, to see potential where others saw only threat. The message was clear. God's mercy extended even to Saul of Tarsus. The worst sinner could become the greatest saint. The most violent persecutor could become the most eloquent preacher of peace. The man who had tried to stamp out the flame of faith could become a blazing fire that would illuminate nations. But this revelation did not erase the risk. Ananias still had to walk to Straight Street. He still had to enter that house. He still had to approach a man who, for all he knew, might arrest him the moment he arrived. God had shown Ananias the future, revealing what Saul would become, but Ananias still had to live through the present moment, with all its uncertainty and fear. He had to trust God's word about tomorrow while taking a very real, very dangerous step today. So Ananias made a choice. He chose to trust. He chose to believe that God's plan was greater than his fear. He chose to accept that God's ways are higher than human ways, that divine mercy operates on a different scale than human justice. He chose obedience even when the cost was unclear, even when every human instinct screamed to protect himself, even when the rational thing to do was refuse, and he began to walk. Chapter 7. The Walk to Straight Street. Every step must have felt impossibly heavy. The distance from wherever Ananias was to the house on Straight Street was not far in physical terms. Damascus was not a massive city, and Straight Street was one of the main thoroughfares. On any normal day, Ananias could have walked there in minutes without a second thought. But this was not a normal day, and this was not a normal errand. With each step, Ananias was walking away from safety and toward danger. He was moving from the known into the unknown, from the comfortable into the terrifying. The psychological distance was vast, the emotional weight enormous. We do not know what Ananias was thinking as he walked. The biblical account does not give us access to his internal dialogue, does not describe what was going through his mind or heart during those crucial minutes. But we can imagine, based on everything we know about human nature and faith and fear. Did he pray with every step, repeating God's promises like a mantra to steady his racing heart? Did he remind himself over and over of what God had said, that Saul was a chosen instrument, that there was a greater plan at work? Did he think about his family, wondering if he would see them again, mentally preparing farewell words in case this was his last walk through Damascus? Perhaps he thought about the other believers in the city, the ones who were hiding, afraid of the very man Ananias was now approaching. What would they think if they knew what he was doing? Would they call him brave or foolish? A hero or a traitor for consorting with the enemy? Would they understand that he was obeying God? Or would they question his judgment and his loyalty? Or perhaps Ananias focused on the specific words God had spoken to him, turning them over in his mind, examining them from every angle. He is a chosen instrument of mine. That phrase must have seemed surreal, almost impossible to believe. Saul, chosen by God? The man who had been God's enemy was actually God's servant. The one who had persecuted the church was going to become its advocate. Maybe he clung to that phrase, letting it drown out the whispers of doubt and fear. Maybe he chose to see Saul not as he was, but as God said he would become. Maybe he practiced calling him brother in his mind, trying out the words, preparing himself to speak them when the moment came. As Ananias navigated the streets of Damascus, passing vendors calling out their wares, neighbours engaged in conversation, children playing games in the dusty roads, walking through the familiar landscape of his daily life, he was engaged in an interior journey as well. This was not just a physical walk through the city. It was a walk of faith through fear. It was a journey from doubt toward trust. It was a passage from what made sense to what God had commanded. Every step was a choice. Every moment was an opportunity to turn back, to reconsider, to let fear win. Ananias could have stopped at any point. He could have decided this was too much to ask, too dangerous to attempt, too foolish to pursue. He could have rationalized that he had misheard, that the vision was not clear enough, that he should wait for more confirmation. He could have convinced himself that God would understand if he chose safety over obedience, that surely God would not want him to throw his life away. But he kept walking, one foot in front of the other, step after step, block after block, drawing closer to Straight Street with each passing moment. There is something profoundly ordinary about this part of the story, and that ordinariness is itself powerful. No angels appeared to escort him through the streets. No miraculous signs confirmed he was going the right way. No voice from heaven provided running commentary or reassurance. No supernatural protection was visibly manifested. Ananias simply had to put one foot in front of the other, trusting that God would be faithful to the word he had spoken, believing that God's presence was with him, even though he could not see or feel it. This is often what obedience looks like in real life. Not dramatic or spectacular, but quiet and steady. Not accompanied by thunder and lightning, but carried out in ordinary streets on ordinary days, doing the next right thing even when we are afraid. Moving forward even when we cannot see the outcome. Trusting that God is present even when we feel alone. Acting on faith even when every emotion screams otherwise. Ananias reached Straight Street. The familiar thoroughfare stretched before him, lined with houses and shops, bustling with the normal activity of a weekday in Damascus. He found the house of Judas, the specific residence God had identified. He stood at the threshold, his heart pounding so loudly he wondered if others could hear it. His mouth was dry, his hands were trembling, his mind was racing with final doubts and questions. This was it, the moment of ultimate decision. Once he stepped through that door, there would be no going back. Once he entered, his fate would be sealed. He would be face to face with Saul of Tarsus, the most feared persecutor in the region, and whatever happened next would be beyond his control. And then, with a prayer on his lips and fear in his heart, with faith barely stronger than his terror, with obedience winning a narrow victory over self-preservation, Ananias reached out, pushed open the door, and entered. Chapter 8. Laying hands on the enemy. The scene inside the house must have been surreal. Nothing like what Ananias had imagined during his walk through Damascus. Saul of Tarsus, the feared persecutor whose name had been whispered in terror throughout the Christian community, was not the imposing figure Ananias might have expected. He was not pacing the room with menacing energy. He was not surrounded by soldiers ready to arrest anyone who entered. He was not the picture of strength and authority that his reputation suggested. Instead, Saul was vulnerable in a way he had perhaps never been before in his adult life. He was blind, his eyes seeing nothing but darkness for 3 days now. He was weakened by 3 days of fasting, having taken neither food nor water since his encounter on the Damascus road. He sat in the house of Judas, dependent on the kindness of a man he did not know, unable to care for even his most basic needs. The man who had always been in control, who had wielded authority over others, who had decided the fate of countless believers, was now helpless. He had been struck down on the road to Damascus by a light from heaven, confronted directly by Jesus Christ himself, the very man whose followers Saul had been persecuting. The voice from heaven had asked, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" And Saul had realized in that blinding instant that he had not been serving God at all. He had been fighting against God. Everything he thought he knew, everything he believed about righteousness and truth, had been shattered in a single moment of divine revelation. When Ananias entered the room, Saul was praying as he had been for days, crying out to God for understanding, for forgiveness, for direction. He could not see who was approaching. He could only wait and hope, as God had shown him in a vision, that a man named Ananias would come and restore his sight. He was completely at the mercy of whoever entered that room. Ananias approached slowly, each step measured, his eyes taking in the scene. There he was, Saul of Tarsus, the enemy, the threat, the man who had caused so much pain and suffering. But seeing him like this, blind and broken and humbled, something shifted in Ananias's heart. This was not a monster. This was a man who was suffering, a man who needed help, a man whom God loved. And what Ananias said next, the words he chose in this pivotal moment, became one of the most beautiful expressions of grace in all of Scripture. He did not address Saul with accusations or demands. He did not remind him of his crimes or require a confession of wrongdoing. He did not list the believers who had suffered at Saul's hands. He did not ask for guarantees that Saul had truly changed. He did not treat him as an enemy, or even as a stranger who needed to prove himself trustworthy. Instead, Ananias called him Brother Saul. Brother, a term of kinship, of belonging, of family, a word that communicated complete acceptance. In those 2 words, Ananias extended to Saul what he'd never given to the Christians he persecuted: grace, unconditional, unearned, undeserved grace. Ananias spoke to Saul not as the man he had been, but as the man God was making him to be. He offered fellowship before Saul had done anything to earn it. He welcomed him into the family before any transformation was visible. He called him brother when Saul probably still felt like an enemy, to himself as much as to others. "Brother Saul," Ananias said, and his voice carried no trace of fear now, only compassion. "The Lord Jesus, who appeared to you on the road by which you came, has sent me, so that you may regain your sight and be filled with the Holy Spirit." These words must have washed over Saul like cool water over parched ground. The Lord Jesus had sent Ananias. Jesus, whom Saul had been persecuting, had sent help. Jesus, whom Saul had blasphemed, had arranged his healing. Jesus, whom Saul had denied was the Messiah, was showing mercy to his enemy. Ananias placed his hands on Saul. This was a gesture of blessing, of prayer, of connection. It was also an act of extraordinary courage and profound vulnerability. To touch someone was to make oneself physically vulnerable. Ananias was close enough now that Saul could have grabbed him, could have overpowered him despite his weakened state, could have signalled to any soldiers who might have been nearby. But Ananias was not acting out of fear anymore. He was acting out of obedience to God and love for a man he had every reason to hate. His hands, perhaps still trembling slightly, rested on Saul's shoulders or head, and in that touch something powerful was communicated: acceptance, welcome, forgiveness, hope. The first physical contact Saul had from a follower of Jesus was not a blow or a rejection, but a blessing. The first words he heard from a Christian were not condemnation, but kinship. And as Ananias prayed, as he called on the name of Jesus over this man who had terrorized Jesus' followers, as he asked God to heal and fill and restore, God moved in power. Chapter 9. The Miracle. Immediately, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes. The biblical description is specific and unusual, suggesting something almost physical happening. Whether these were actual scaly formations that had covered his eyes, or whether this is metaphorical language describing the restoration of sight, the effect was immediate and complete. The blindness that had afflicted him since his encounter on the Damascus road lifted in an instant. Light flooded in, painful and brilliant and beautiful after 3 days of absolute darkness. Shapes became clear, colour returned. The world snapped back into focus, and the first face Saul saw with his newly restored vision was the face of Ananias, a man extending mercy instead of judgment, offering healing instead of harm, speaking blessing instead of curse. Imagine what Saul must have felt in that moment. Relief at being able to see again. Gratitude for this stranger who had risked everything to obey God. Wonder at the mercy being shown to him. Shame at what he had done to people like Ananias. Awe at the power of Jesus, who could heal with a word spoken through a willing servant. But the physical healing, miraculous as it was only the beginning. The text tells us that Saul was filled with the Holy Spirit. This was the true transformation, the deep work that would change not just Saul's circumstances, but his very identity. The Spirit of God took up residence in the heart of a man who had been an enemy of God's people. The same Spirit who had empowered Jesus during his earthly ministry, who had descended on the disciples at Pentecost like tongues of fire, who had enabled the early believers to speak in languages they did not know and perform miracles in Jesus' name, now filled Saul of Tarsus. This was not just a change of mind or a new set of beliefs. This was a fundamental remaking of who Saul was at the deepest level. The Spirit would now guide his thoughts, empower his words, direct his steps. The Spirit would give him the courage to face persecution, the wisdom to navigate complex theological questions, the love to serve people he once would have despised. The Spirit would transform Saul from the inside out, making him into the man God had always intended him to be. Saul rose to his feet, his strength returning, his vision clear, his heart full, and he was baptized immediately. There was no lengthy waiting period to see if the conversion was genuine. There was no probationary phase to prove his sincerity. There were no committees formed to debate whether a former persecutor should be allowed into the church. Ananias baptized him right then, welcoming him into the community of believers without hesitation. It was a public declaration of Saul's new identity. Baptism symbolized death and resurrection. The old Saul, the persecutor, the enemy, the violent zealot, was symbolically buried in the waters of baptism, and when he came up out of the water, the new Saul, soon to be known as Paul, emerged as a brother in Christ. His past was not erased, but it was redeemed. His sins were not forgotten, but they were forgiven. His old identity was not ignored, but it was transformed. After his baptism, Saul took food and was strengthened. His 3-day fast was over. He had been physically weakened, spiritually transformed, and now he began to recover. He ate, perhaps sharing a meal with Ananias and others in the household, breaking bread with brothers and sisters he would once have arrested. He drank, quenching a thirst that was both physical and spiritual. He was nourished, body and soul, preparing for the mission that lay ahead. But he was not the same man who had approached Damascus just days earlier. Everything had changed. His convictions had been overturned. His mission had been reversed. His heart had been remade. The man who had been on his way to arrest Christians had become one. The man who had sought to destroy the church would become one of its greatest builders. The man who had been utterly certain of his righteousness had discovered he had been utterly wrong and had been shown overwhelming mercy in spite of it. This moment, this encounter between Ananias and Saul, marks one of the most significant turning points in Christian history. The man who would write much of the New Testament, whose letters would be read by billions of people across 20 centuries, who would plant churches throughout the Roman Empire and beyond, who would articulate the theology of grace and faith that would shape Christianity for millennia, began his ministry not in a grand public revelation, but in a quiet house on an ordinary street in Damascus, through the obedient hands of an ordinary believer named Ananias. Chapter 10. Quiet obedience, lasting impact. After this encounter, Ananias fades from the biblical narrative almost as quietly as he entered it. We do not know what happened to him after he left that house on Straight Street. Did he return home, overwhelmed by what he had just witnessed, struggling to process the magnitude of what God had done? Did he immediately share his experience with other believers in Damascus, confirming that Saul's conversion was genuine, urging them to overcome their fear and welcome this former enemy? Did Ananias stay in contact with Saul during his days in Damascus? Did he introduce him to other believers, vouching for his transformation, helping to bridge the gap between a man with a terrible reputation and a community understandably skeptical of his sudden change? Did they pray together, study scripture together, share meals together in those early days of Saul's new faith? Or did Ananias simply return to his ordinary life, continuing his quiet ministry in Damascus, praying and serving and obeying as he always had? Did he watch from a distance as Saul began to preach in the synagogues, marvelling at how boldly this former persecutor now proclaimed Jesus as the Messiah? Did he feel a quiet satisfaction knowing he had played a part in something so significant? Or was he simply grateful to have been used by God and ready to move on to the next task of faithfulness? The book of Acts does not tell us. Ananias is mentioned briefly in one other place, providing us with a final glimpse of how he was remembered. When Paul, years later, recounts his conversion story before an audience in Jerusalem, he mentions Ananias with respect and honour. He describes him as a devout man according to the law, well spoken of by all the Jews living there. It is a simple description, but it carries immense weight. Ananias was devout. His relationship with God was real and deep. He was not just going through religious motions or maintaining appearances. His faith permeated his life, shaped his decisions, guided his actions. He was well spoken of by all the Jews. This tells us that Ananias had maintained his integrity even in a divided community. Jews who did not follow Jesus still respected him. He had not become so focused on his Christian identity that he alienated his broader community. He had found a way to remain faithful to his new beliefs while still honouring his heritage and maintaining relationships. Even in Paul's later testimony, decades after the event, when Paul had become famous and influential, when he had travelled thousands of miles and planted dozens of churches and written letters that would be treasured as scripture, he still remembered Ananias with honour. He still acknowledged the role this ordinary disciple had played in his story. He did not minimise Ananias's contribution or act as if his conversion had been solely between him and Jesus. He gave credit where credit was due. Meanwhile, Saul, who became known as Paul, went on to change the world in ways that are difficult to fully measure. He spent several days with the disciples in Damascus, learning from them, sharing his experience, beginning to understand the faith he had once tried to destroy. And then, immediately, surprisingly, boldly, he began proclaiming Jesus in the synagogues, declaring that Jesus was the Son of God. The people who heard him were amazed and confused. Some could not believe their ears. Was this not the man who had come to Damascus to arrest believers? The man with letters from the high priest authorizing him to drag Christians back to Jerusalem in chains? How was he now preaching the very message he had tried to destroy? What had happened to him on the road? Was this some kind of trick, some elaborate trap to identify more believers? But Paul preached with such conviction, such passion, such intimate knowledge of both scripture and personal experience that people could not simply dismiss him. He argued that Jesus was the Messiah, pointing to prophecies in the Hebrew scriptures, explaining how Jesus fulfilled ancient predictions, connecting dots that most had never considered. His background as a Pharisee, trained in the law, gave him unique credibility. When he said Jesus was the fulfillment of Jewish hope, people had to listen, even if they disagreed. Paul's ministry took him across the Mediterranean world. He planted churches in major cities: Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, Rome. He wrote letters that would become scripture, letters that addressed practical church problems and profound theological truths, letters that explored the implications of grace and faith, letters that would be read and studied and treasured by believers for millennia. He debated philosophers in Athens, presenting the gospel in terms Greek intellectuals could understand. He stood trial before Roman governors Felix and Festus, using his legal knowledge and Roman citizenship to his advantage. He survived shipwrecks and beatings and imprisonment, enduring suffering that would have broken most people. He became one of the most influential figures in Christian history, second perhaps only to Jesus himself in terms of impact on the faith. But none of it would have happened without Ananias, without the quiet obedience of one ordinary believer who chose to trust God even when it meant walking toward his greatest fear, without the compassionate hands placed on a blind enemy and the grace-filled words, "Brother Saul," without someone willing to be the first to welcome, the first to accept, the first to extend fellowship to a man everyone else feared and hated. History often celebrates the prominent figures, the ones whose names are known, whose achievements are recorded, whose words are remembered. We remember Paul's letters, Peter's sermons, John's gospel. We study their words, analyse their theology, trace their journeys across maps of the ancient world. And rightly so. These men were used by God in extraordinary ways. Their contributions to the Christian faith cannot be overstated. But behind every prominent ministry there are countless Ananiases, faithful people who show up when called, even when it costs them something, who obey even when afraid, even when obedience seems foolish or dangerous, who extend grace when it would be easier to withhold it, when withholding it would even seem justified, who do the quiet work of welcoming, healing, praying and serving without any guarantee of recognition or reward, without any promise that their names will be remembered. Ananias represents all of them. He represents the Sunday school teacher whose students become missionaries, carrying the gospel to distant places, but whose own name is forgotten. The parent whose faithful prayers shape a child's life in ways that ripple across generations, though no plaque will ever bear their name. The friend who offers a listening ear at just the right moment, speaking a word of encouragement that redirects someone's entire path, never knowing the full impact of their compassion. The stranger who shows unexpected kindness to someone at a crossroads, tipping the scales toward faith rather than despair. The ordinary believers whose obedience becomes the foundation for extraordinary moves of God. We do not know if Ananias ever fully grasped the significance of what he had done. Did he realize, as he walked away from that house on Straight Street, that he had just met the future author of Romans, Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Thessalonians? Did he understand that the moment he called Saul brother and laid hands on him in prayer would echo through centuries of church history, would be retold in countless sermons, would inspire believers facing their own calls to risky obedience? Probably not. He probably went home thinking he had simply obeyed God in a particularly difficult situation. He probably did not imagine that his name would appear in Scripture, that his story would be told around the world, that his act of courage would encourage believers 2,000 years later. And perhaps that is part of the beauty of his story, part of what makes it so powerful and so relevant to ordinary believers in every generation. Ananias did not obey because he understood the full implications. He did not go to Saul's house thinking about his legacy or his place in history. He went because God told him to go. He obeyed because he trusted God. He did what was right in front of him without knowing the ultimate outcome. And that is often all God asks of us. Epilogue: The faith of the unknown. The story of Ananias invites us to reconsider what faithfulness looks like, to re-examine our assumptions about significance and impact, to challenge our culture's obsession with visibility and platform and influence. In a world that celebrates fame, that measures success by followers and likes and public recognition, Ananias reminds us that the most significant kingdom work often happens in obscurity, behind closed doors, in quiet moments of obedience that no one else witnesses. His legacy is not found in any writing he left behind. We have no letters from Ananias, no recorded sermons, no systematic theology bearing his name. His legacy is not in any church he planted, no building erected in his honour, no institution carrying his name. His legacy is not in any miracle he performed, no healing ministry that made him famous, no supernatural gift that drew crowds. His legacy is found in one act of obedience that required extraordinary courage, one moment of saying yes to God when everything in him wanted to say no. Think about what Ananias risked. He risked his physical safety, walking unarmed and alone into a meeting with a man known for violence against Christians. He risked his reputation in the community, associating himself with the most feared persecutor of the faith. He risked his very life, making himself vulnerable to someone who had proven repeatedly that he showed no mercy to believers. The cost could have been immediate arrest, imprisonment, torture, or execution. And Ananias walked toward that cost anyway. He walked toward danger when everyone else was fleeing from it. While other believers in Damascus were hiding, while families were making plans to escape if necessary, while the community was paralyzed by fear, Ananias walked directly toward the source of their terror. He extended grace to someone who had shown none, who had torn families apart and filled prisons with innocent people. He called a persecutor brother before any transformation was visible to human eyes, speaking words of kinship to someone who had been an enemy just days before. But Ananias also gained something profound, something that made the risk worthwhile even though he could not have known it at the time. He gained the privilege of witnessing one of history's greatest redemptions, of being present for a transformation that would change the course of Christianity. He gained the joy of being used by God in a pivotal moment, of knowing that he had been part of something far bigger than himself. He gained the assurance that comes from obedience, the deep peace that follows when we trust God even in our fear, the satisfaction of having done the right thing regardless of the cost. The question Ananias faced is the question every believer eventually faces in some form. The circumstances differ, the specific challenges vary, but the core issue remains the same. Will I obey God even when it costs me something? Even when I am afraid? Even when I do not understand the full picture? Even when what God asks seems impossible or dangerous, or foolish by human standards? Even when everyone around me thinks I am making a mistake? Even when I could justify refusing? Ananias said yes. He said yes not because he was fearless, but because he feared God more than he feared Saul. His fear of disappointing God, of missing his purpose, of disobeying the voice that had called him by name, was greater than his fear of danger or death. He said yes not because obedience was easy or comfortable or convenient, but because he had cultivated a life of faithfulness that prepared him for this moment. Years of showing up for prayer meetings, of offering his home for gatherings, of serving quietly and consistently, had built spiritual muscles that could lift the weight of this extraordinary calling. He said yes not because he knew the outcome, not because God had guaranteed his safety, not because he could see how it would all work out. He said yes because he trusted the one who did know, who did see, who was working all things together for purposes far greater than Ananias could imagine. And because of his yes, Paul the Apostle entered the world. Churches were planted from Jerusalem to Rome and beyond. The gospel spread to the Gentiles, breaking through barriers of ethnicity and culture. Letters were written that would teach and inspire billions of people across 2,000 years of history. Theological truths were articulated that would shape Christian thought for millennia, all because one ordinary man chose to obey one extraordinary God. There is deep comfort in this story for anyone who has ever felt insignificant or overlooked, for anyone who has wondered if their life matters, for anyone who has questioned whether their small acts of faithfulness make any real difference. Your obedience matters more than you know. Your faithfulness, even in small things, even in hidden moments, even when no one is watching or recognizing or applauding, matters to God and can have impacts you cannot begin to imagine. You may never know the full impact of your choices. You may never see how the seeds you plant today grow into forests tomorrow, how your encouragement to a struggling friend helps them persevere and eventually touch countless other lives. But God sees, God knows, and God uses willing hearts to accomplish his purposes, often in ways that remain hidden until eternity reveals the full story. Ananias teaches us that heroism is not always loud or visible or dramatic. Sometimes it is simply putting one foot in front of the other when you're afraid, doing the next right thing, even when your hands are shaking. Sometimes it is extending kindness when anger would be justified, when bitterness would be understandable, when revenge would feel satisfying. Sometimes it is saying yes to God when everything in you wants to say no, when every rational argument suggests refusal, when self-preservation screams loudly. Sometimes it is calling someone brother when the world calls them enemy, seeing potential where others see only threat, extending grace where others extend judgment. So tonight, as you reflect on this story, as you let these truths sink deep into your heart, consider the Ananias moments in your own life. The times when God has asked you to do something that scared you, that pushed you beyond your comfort zone, that required more faith than you thought you possessed. The opportunities to extend grace to someone who did not deserve it, to show kindness to someone who had hurt you, to help someone everyone else had written off. The whispers of the Spirit inviting you toward obedience that required faith, toward actions that looked foolish to human eyes, toward choices that cost you something but aligned with heaven's purposes. And remember that God does not always choose the famous or the prominent or the powerful. Sometimes, perhaps often, He chooses the faithful, the ones who show up day after day, who do the unglamorous work of building kingdom foundations, the ones who listen when others are too busy talking, who notice when others are too distracted, who care when others are too self-focused, the ones who, despite their fears and limitations, despite their ordinary circumstances and unremarkable resumes, despite their questions and doubts and struggles, are willing to say, "Here I am, Lord." Because history is changed not only by the Pauls of the world, the ones who preach to thousands and write great letters and plant churches across empires, whose names become famous and whose words are studied for centuries. History is also changed, perhaps primarily changed, by the Ananiases, the ones whose names are remembered only by God, whose acts of obedience happen in quiet houses on ordinary streets, whose legacy is measured not by fame but by faithfulness, not by recognition but by righteousness, not by applause but by authenticity. May we all have the courage of Ananias, the courage to trust God even when we are afraid, even when the path ahead is unclear, even when obedience might cost us everything. The courage to obey even when we do not understand, when we cannot see the full picture, when the instructions seem to contradict common sense. The courage to extend grace even to our enemies, to those who have hurt us, to those whom everyone else has rejected. The courage to walk toward what terrifies us because we believe in the deepest part of our being that God's plan is greater than our fear, that His purposes are worth any risk, that His presence is sufficient for any challenge. And may we remember that in the kingdom of God no act of obedience is ever wasted, no matter how small it seems. No step of faith is ever forgotten, no matter how private. No moment of choosing God over self is ever insignificant, no matter how humble the circumstances. The quiet faithfulness of ordinary believers can become the foundation for extraordinary transformation, the catalyst for movements that change nations, the hinge upon which history turns. The story of Ananias reminds us that we serve a God who specializes in redemption, who delights in transforming the unlikely and the impossible, a God who extends mercy to the most unlikely people, seeing potential where others see only failure, offering grace where others offer only judgment. A God who invites us to participate in His work of transformation, not as perfect people but as willing people, not as those who have it all figured out but as those who trust Him even when confused, not as the fearless but as those who choose faith over fear. A God who sees not only who we are in this moment, but who we can become through His grace. A God who asks us to see others the same way, to look past their current state and glimpse their potential, to offer grace before it is deserved and welcome before it is earned. Brother Saul became Paul the Apostle because Ananias was willing to obey, because one man chose to trust God's vision over his own fear. And who knows what transformations await in our own time, what futures hang in the balance, what kingdom work could unfold if we, like Ananias, choose faith over fear and obedience over safety. Who knows what modern-day Sauls are waiting for someone to welcome them, to call them brother or sister, to see them as God sees them rather than as their reputation suggests. May we be people who, when God calls our name in the silence of prayer, when he interrupts our comfortable plans with uncomfortable instructions, when he asks us to do what seems impossible or dangerous or foolish, respond with the same words that Ananias spoke, words that changed history. Here I am, Lord. And may we trust, with every fibre of our being, that wherever God sends us, whatever he asks of us, however difficult the obedience, his presence goes with us into every uncertain situation. His purposes are good, even when we cannot see how. His plan is greater than our fear, and our obedience, however small it may seem to human eyes, however hidden from public view, however ordinary the circumstances, matters more than we could possibly know. The world may never know your name. History books may never record your story. No monument may mark your acts of faithfulness. But God knows. God sees. God remembers. And in his economy, the Ananiases are just as essential as the Pauls. The quiet obedience of unknown disciples is just as powerful as the public ministry of famous apostles. The willing hearts of ordinary believers are just as valuable as the dramatic gifts of celebrated leaders. So whatever God is asking of you today, whatever impossible thing he has placed before you, whatever fear you must walk through to obey, remember Ananias. Remember that God specializes in using ordinary people for extraordinary purposes. Remember that your yes matters, that your obedience can change everything, that your willingness to trust can become the doorway through which transformation enters the world. And may we all live in such a way that when our own stories are finally told in full, when eternity reveals what our faithfulness accomplished, we will discover that our quiet obedience, our hidden acts of trust, our willingness to say yes even when afraid, mattered more than we ever dared to believe. Hello there, dear friend. Welcome to Sacred Rest. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight for this gentle journey into peaceful slumber. Before we begin our sleep story, I want to invite you to settle in comfortably. Find that perfect position where your body can fully relax. Perhaps adjust your pillow just so, and allow your blankets to cradle you in warmth. How was your day today? Was it filled with joys or perhaps some challenges? Whatever experiences you carry today, know that now is the time to set them aside. This is your moment for rest and renewal. What time is it for you right now? Late evening? The middle of the night? And where in the world are you resting tonight? Perhaps in a cosy apartment in a bustling city, or maybe a quiet home in the countryside. Wherever you are, I'm grateful that our paths have crossed in this peaceful moment. If you found comfort in tonight's journey, I warmly invite you to subscribe to Sacred Rest. Each night we create a sanctuary of calm together, a gentle refuge from the world's noise. Tonight we'll rest in the words of one of the most beloved Psalms, a passage written for weary hearts, quiet minds, and those who long for peace. The 23rd Psalm has comforted countless souls throughout the centuries, and tonight we'll let its ancient wisdom guide us into restful sleep. Take a deep breath with me now. Inhale slowly and exhale completely. Again, breathe in peace and breathe out tension. One more time, breathe in divine rest and exhale all your cares. Let us begin our journey beside still waters. Verse 1, The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a vast rolling meadow. The early morning light bathes everything in a soft golden glow. The air is perfectly still, with just the faintest whisper of a breeze caressing your face. Before you stretches an endless carpet of vibrant green grass, so lush and inviting that you can almost feel its softness beneath your feet without even taking a step. Small wildflowers dot the landscape with gentle purples, whites and yellows, not in overwhelming abundance, but in perfect, balanced harmony. In the distance you notice a figure, the shepherd. There is something immediately comforting about this presence. Even from afar you sense profound care, a watchful attention that encompasses you completely. The shepherd moves unhurriedly among a small flock of sheep who graze peacefully, utterly at ease. With each breath you take, feel the certainty growing within you. You are not alone. You are watched over. You are cared for. The Lord is my shepherd. Feel the personal nature of these words. Not just a shepherd, but my shepherd. This relationship is intimate, attentive, and constant. The shepherd knows your name, knows your needs, knows the unique contours of your heart. I shall not want. These words settle over you like a warm blanket. Everything you truly need is provided. There is enough. You are enough. In this moment, all is well. The tension in your shoulders begins to release. Your breathing slows naturally. Your mind grows quieter as you gaze across the meadow, feeling the first gentle waves of true rest washing over you. Let yourself be here fully, in this place of sufficiency and care. There is nothing to strive for, nothing to chase, nothing to fix. The shepherd is present, and that presence changes everything. Verse 2, He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. As you continue to gaze across the meadow, you feel a gentle invitation to move forward, to enter fully into this landscape of peace. Your feet begin to carry you forward, almost of their own accord. With each step, you feel the soft grass beneath your feet, cool, yielding, supporting. The morning dew still clings to each blade of grass, catching the sunlight and transforming the ordinary into the extraordinary. Thousands of tiny prisms reflecting light in all directions. As you walk, your passing leaves momentary impressions in the grass and dew, small testimonies that you are here, that you matter, that your presence changes things in small but meaningful ways. The air feels cleaner here, easier to breathe. Each inhalation fills your lungs completely. Each exhalation releases something you didn't even realize you were carrying. After walking for a time, it could be minutes or hours, time seems different here. You begin to hear it, the gentle rhythmic sound of water, not crashing waves or rushing rapids, but the subtle musical sound of water that is at rest, water that is at peace with itself. The shepherd has gone ahead of you and now stands waiting at the edge of a crystal clear pool. The surface is still, almost mirror-like, reflecting the blues of the sky and the greens of the surrounding trees with perfect clarity. Only occasionally does a gentle ripple move across its surface, as if the water itself is breathing slowly, contentedly. He makes me lie down. Notice these words. Not forces, not commands, but makes me lie down. Like a parent who knows when their child needs rest before the child does. There is tender authority here, loving insistence. The shepherd knows that true rest isn't always automatic for us. Sometimes we need to be guided into it, led to surrender to it. Find a perfect spot near the water's edge. The grass here seems even softer, as if specially prepared for you. Allow yourself to lower down, to release the weight of your body fully into the earth that supports you. Lie back and look up at the vast blue sky above, wisps of white clouds moving with imperceptible slowness across its expanse. He leads me beside still waters. Still waters run deep, they say. There is profound quiet here, but it's not emptiness. It's fullness, completeness. The still waters offer reflection, clarity, and deep refreshment. Listen to the almost imperceptible sounds of the water gently lapping at the shoreline. A rhythm like slow breathing, like a heartbeat. Perhaps your own breathing begins to synchronize with this ancient rhythm. Inhale peace, exhale tension, inhale trust, exhale worry. Feel the warmth of the sun on your face, the support of the earth beneath you, the watchful presence of the shepherd nearby. You're completely safe, completely held, completely at peace. Verse 3. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. As you rest beside the still waters, something remarkable begins to happen within you. It's subtle at first, like the first light of dawn or the first notes of a distant song. There's a sense of something being repaired, renewed, restored. He restores my soul. Restoration is different from replacement. The shepherd doesn't discard what is worn or broken. Instead, with infinite patience and skill, he mends, strengthens, and beautifies. All the frayed edges of your being, the worries that have worn thin your peace, the hurts that have torn your confidence, the fears that have unravelled your trust, all these are being gathered up by gentle, knowing hands. Imagine this restoration happening now with each breath you take, the scattered pieces of yourself being gathered, the depleted places being refilled, the dimmed lights being rekindled. Your soul, that deepest, truest part of you, being remembered to wholeness. After a time of this peaceful restoration, you become aware that the shepherd is standing nearby, ready to continue the journey. With no urgency but clear purpose, he gestures toward a path that winds away from the still waters, through a grove of ancient trees. Feeling refreshed in a way that seems to reach beyond physical rest, you rise and follow. The path beneath your feet is not wide or imposing, but it is clear, a gentle track worn by the faithful passing of many feet over many years. Those who have walked this way before have left not just their footprints, but something of their faith, their hope, their trust in the shepherd's leading. He leads me in paths of righteousness. As you walk this path, you notice it doesn't always take the easiest route. Sometimes it curves around obstacles rather than removing them. Sometimes it climbs gentle rises that require more effort, but reveal more beautiful vistas. Always, it seems to follow a wisdom beyond what is immediately apparent. The word righteousness floats through your mind, not as a harsh standard of perfection, but as a word that simply means the right way, or the good path. This is a path aligned with goodness, with wholeness, with the way things are meant to be. For his name's sake. These words remind you that the shepherd guides with purpose, with integrity. The path reflects something essential about who the shepherd is. Faithful, good, trustworthy. In following, you participate in a story larger than your own, a goodness that ripples outward beyond what you can see. The dappled sunlight filters through the leaves above, creating patterns of light and shadow that dance across the path as a gentle breeze moves through the branches. The air is filled with the scent of earth and growing things. Birds call to one another from tree to tree, not in frantic chatter, but in peaceful conversation. With each step on this path, you feel more aligned, more centered, more at home in yourself and in the world. The restoration that began by the still waters continues as you walk, as if the very act of following where you are led brings its own kind of healing. Verse 4. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The path now begins to descend gradually, and the bright openness of the meadow gives way to a different landscape. The trees grow closer together, their canopy thicker, allowing less light to penetrate. It is not darkness exactly, but a deep blue-tinted dimness, the kind that makes colours softer and sounds more muted. You have entered a valley. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, these ancient words name a universal experience, those times when light seems distant, when the path ahead is unclear, when what was once certain now feels tenuous. This valley could represent anything in your life that brings sadness, uncertainty or fear, illness, loss, anxiety, transition, grief. But notice, it is the valley of the shadow of death. A shadow may darken, but it cannot ultimately harm. A shadow has no substance of its own. It is merely evidence that light exists, that something stands between you and that light for a time, and most importantly, this valley is something you walk through, not something where you will remain. The path narrows here, requiring more attention to each step. The ground is uneven in places, scattered with small stones. Yet even in this challenging terrain you notice something remarkable. The shepherd's presence has changed. While before the shepherd led the way, now he walks directly beside you, closer than before. For you are with me. Feel the profound shift in these words. No longer speaking about the shepherd in the third person, he leads, but speaking directly to him. You are with me. In the deepest valley, the relationship becomes most intimate, the presence most palpable. In the shepherd's hand is a rod, a symbol of protection and authority. With the other hand, he carries a staff with a curved end, perfect for guiding, for rescuing, for drawing near what might stray. These are not weapons of aggression, but tools of care. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. There is comfort in knowing you are protected, guided, kept close. The valley may be real, its challenges genuine, but you do not face them alone or unequipped. As you continue walking through this valley together, notice that your eyes have adjusted to the dimness. What first appeared as shapeless shadows now reveal themselves as ancient trees, their massive trunks testifying to all they have weathered and survived. The forest floor beneath your feet is soft with decades of fallen leaves, creating a natural cushion for your steps. Even here, especially here, there is beauty to be found. Small flowers that thrive in low light, the intricate patterns of moss growing on stone, the occasional shaft of sunlight breaking through, illuminating dust motes that dance like tiny stars in the beam. And always, the steady presence of the shepherd beside you, matching his pace to yours, unhurried, unworried, utterly present. With each step through this valley, your fear diminishes, not because the valley changes, but because your awareness of his presence grows. Verse 5, You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. The path begins to ascend again, gently but steadily. The trees thin out, allowing more light to filter through. After walking for a time, you and the shepherd emerge from the valley into a wide circular clearing surrounded by ancient olive trees. The light here is golden and warm, suggesting late afternoon approaching evening. In the centre of this clearing stands something unexpected and wonderful. A table. Not a rough outdoor table, but one that would be at home in a palace, beautifully crafted of polished wood, covered with a fine linen cloth that gleams white in the golden light. You prepare a table before me. The shepherd moves ahead and gestures for you to approach to take a seat. As you draw nearer, you see that the table is set for a feast. There are plates of bread still warm from the oven, bowls of olives and roasted vegetables, platters of fruit so ripe they glisten, and goblets of deep red wine catching the light like liquid rubies. And this feast has been prepared specifically for you, each element chosen with intimate knowledge of what delights you, what nourishes you, what you need most in this moment. In the presence of my enemies. The clearing is not entirely enclosed. There are gaps between the protective circle of trees, and through these openings you can glimpse shadowy forms moving at the edges of your vision. These represent whatever has opposed you, whatever has tried to convince you that you are unloved, unsafe, or without resources. Fear, doubt, regret, worry, pain. Yet here is the miracle. Their presence cannot touch this moment. They cannot approach the table. They cannot prevent the feast. They can only watch as you are honoured, nourished and delighted beyond measure. Taking your place at the table, You feel the shepherd's hands come to rest gently on your head. From a small alabaster jar, he pours fragrant oil that runs down warm and soothing. You anoint my head with oil. In ancient times, oil was poured on the heads of honoured guests, of those being healed, and of those being set apart for special purpose. To be anointed is to be distinguished, to be marked for blessing and protection. Feel this oil of gladness seeping into your very thoughts, soothing away tension, bringing clarity and peace. Before you on the table stands a simple clay cup. As you watch, the shepherd fills it with clear, sparkling water that catches the light like diamonds. But he doesn't stop when the cup is full. He keeps pouring until the water spills over the rim, running across the table in rivulets of abundance. My cup overflows. This is not merely enough, this is more than enough. Not scarcity managed, but abundance celebrated. Not just what you need, but what allows you to flourish, to share, to live from a place of rich sufficiency. As the sun begins its slow descent toward the horizon, take time at this table. Taste the bread that satisfies. Drink deeply from the cup that never empties. Feel the warm breeze against your skin, carrying the scent of olive trees and wild herbs. Know yourself seen, provided for, and celebrated in this moment. Verse 6. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. As the feast comes to its natural conclusion, a profound contentment settles over you. The shepherd rises and extends a hand, inviting you to continue the journey as the day's light begins to soften toward evening. You walk together now along a gently winding path that leads toward a distant hill. The setting sun casts long golden rays across the landscape, illuminating everything with a warm, honeyed glow. Each blade of grass, each leaf, each stone along the path seems outlined in light, revealing beauty that was always present but not always visible. As you walk, something catches your attention, a sound behind you like gentle footsteps. Turning slightly, you glimpse two figures following at a respectful distance. They move with grace and purpose, neither hurrying nor lagging behind. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me. These are your companions on the journey, not just occasionally, not just when you remember to call for them, but continuously, faithfully, all the days of my life. Goodness, the active force that brings blessing, that aligns circumstances toward your flourishing, that sees and calls forth the best in you and in others. Mercy, the protective presence that catches you when you stumble, that covers your mistakes with grace, that ensures you're never defined by your worst moments or your greatest weaknesses. These are not abstract concepts, but living realities, as real as the path beneath your feet and the shepherd beside you. They accompany you not because you have earned them or achieved them, but simply because they are given, because they are part of what it means to be shepherded by this particular shepherd. As the path crests the hill, you see it in the near distance, a house aglow with warm light pouring from every window. Not an imposing mansion or a cold palace, but a home, the kind that speaks of safety, of belonging, of returning to where you are most fully known and loved. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This is your destination, not just for tonight, but for all time. The journey leads not to a temporary shelter, but to a permanent belonging, not to a brief respite, but to an eternal home. As you and the shepherd approach, the great wooden door swings open of its own accord, releasing a flood of golden light and the sound of gentle music from within. Standing on the threshold, you can feel the warmth emanating from inside, can sense the welcome that awaits. The word dwell echoes in your mind. Not visit, not stay temporarily, but dwell. To live fully, to be at home, to belong without question or condition, and not just for a season, but forever. Now, as our story draws to its peaceful conclusion, I invite you to return in your mind to that lush green meadow where our journey began. Find again that perfect spot where the grass is softest, where you can lie back and gaze up at the vast canvas of stars now appearing in the darkening sky above. Let go of today. Whatever happened, whatever was said or unsaid, done or undone, release it now. It is finished, complete, and can be set aside. Let go of tomorrow. Whatever awaits you, whatever requires your attention or energy, it will still be there when morning comes. For now, it can wait outside this moment of perfect peace. Be here now, in this sanctuary of rest you've created. Feel the shepherd's peaceful presence nearby, watchful, caring, never slumbering. Let's breathe together slowly, intentionally. Inhale calm, exhale fear, inhale rest, exhale worry, inhale peace, exhale tension, inhale trust, exhale control. With each breath you sink deeper into restful surrender. Your body grows heavier, more relaxed. Your mind grows quieter, the thoughts slowing like leaves gently floating down to land on still water. The words of the psalm flow through you one final time, not as something outside yourself, but as truth taking root within you. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Loving shepherd, watch over this precious one as they rest tonight. Guard their dreams, calm their thoughts, and renew their strength through the gift of deep, restorative sleep. May they know your presence even in unconsciousness. May they feel your peace enveloping them through the watches of the night, and may they awaken refreshed, their soul restored by your unfailing care. Thank you for green pastures of rest, for still waters of peace, for paths of righteousness, for comfort in every valley, for tables of abundance, for overflowing cups, for goodness and mercy that never cease, and for the promise of a forever home in your presence. You are loved, you are safe, you are held. Good night. Hello, dear friend. Welcome to Sacred Rest. I'm so glad you've joined me tonight for this time of peaceful reflection and spiritual rest. Wherever you are in the world right now, I hope this finds you settling into a comfortable space. How was your day? Was it filled with joy and laughter, or perhaps challenges that left you weary? Whatever experiences you've carried through your hours, know that this is a safe place to set them down. What time is it where you are? Perhaps it's the deep of night, when the world has grown quiet and stars pepper the sky. Maybe it's early evening, and you're seeking a moment of calm before sleep. Or perhaps you're listening in the gentle light of dawn. Wherever you're from in our vast, beautiful world, whether you're nestled in a busy city or somewhere quiet and remote, I welcome you to this sacred time. If you found comfort in these meditations, I'd be deeply grateful if you would subscribe to Sacred Rest. Your subscription helps this ministry continue providing peaceful, scripture-based sleep meditations to those who need them most. When we gather together in this digital sanctuary, we create a community of believers finding rest in God's presence. Now I invite you to settle more deeply into your bed or chair. Feel the weight of your body being supported. Notice where you might be holding tension, perhaps in your shoulders, your jaw, or your hands, and gently release it with each breath. Breathe in God's peace and exhale any lingering worries. Tonight, we'll journey across the Sea of Galilee with Jesus and his disciples. We'll witness how even the fiercest storms must bow to his gentle command. In your own life, whatever storms you face, anxiety, uncertainty, fear, or overwhelm, this story reminds us of a profound truth. The one who calms the seas can calm our hearts as well. Let's begin with a prayer. Loving Father, as we prepare for rest, we invite your peace to wash over us. Still our racing thoughts and calm our beating hearts. As we journey through this story of your Son's power over the storm, help us to trust you with the storms in our own lives. May this time be a sanctuary of rest and renewal. In Jesus' name, Amen. The day had been long, wonderfully full but exhausting. Jesus had been teaching since morning, sharing parables about seeds and lamps and the mysterious growth of God's kingdom. Crowds had pressed in around him, their faces eager and questioning, their needs endless. As the golden light of late afternoon stretched across the hillside surrounding the Sea of Galilee, Jesus looked out at the water, its surface catching the amber glow of the setting sun. "Let us go across to the other side," he said simply to his disciples. The men nodded, familiar with their rabbi's ways by now. When the crowds grew too large, when the demands became too constant, Jesus would often seek the quiet of the water or the solitude of the hills. They understood his need for moments of peace. The disciples began preparing a fishing boat, one they had used many times before. It wasn't large, but it was sturdy enough for the journey across the lake. Several of them were fishermen after all. Peter, Andrew, James, and John knew these waters intimately. They had spent countless nights on this very sea, reading its moods, respecting its power, harvesting its bounty. As the last remnants of the crowd dispersed, moving back toward the villages dotting the shoreline, the disciples helped Jesus into the boat. They couldn't help but notice the weariness in his movements, the heaviness in his shoulders. He had given so much of himself that day, healing the sick, answering questions, teaching with stories that somehow made the mysteries of heaven feel tangible and close. There were other boats setting out with them, smaller vessels carrying more followers who weren't ready to end their time with the teacher. The little flotilla pushed away from shore, wooden hulls creaking gently as they slipped into deeper water. Oars dipped rhythmically, creating small whirlpools that glinted copper in the fading light. In the stern of the boat, Jesus found a cushion, a simple thing made of cloth and stuffed with wool. Without ceremony, he laid his head upon it. The gentle rocking motion of the boat, the soft splashing of water against the hull, and the quiet murmuring of his friends' voices created a lullaby that his exhausted body could not resist. Within moments, Jesus was asleep, his breathing deep and even. The disciples continued their work, some rowing, others adjusting the small sail to catch what little breeze stirred across the water. They talked quietly among themselves, occasionally glancing back at their sleeping teacher with affection and protectiveness. "He pushed himself too hard again today," Peter whispered to John. "Did you see how many people he healed?" Matthew added. "And yet he had time to explain his parables to us afterward." "I'm still thinking about the mustard seed," Thomas said thoughtfully. "How something so small can become something so significant." As they conversed, the brilliance of sunset gave way to the soft indigo of early evening. Stars began to appear, first one, then dozens, then hundreds, until the heavens above them shimmered with light. The moon, nearly full, cast a silver pathway across the water. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect night for sailing. But the Sea of Galilee, nestled as it was in a basin surrounded by hills and mountains, was known for its sudden, violent storms. Cool air from the Mediterranean could rush down the mountain passes and collide with the warm air over the lake, creating tempests that arose with frightening speed. And on this night, as Jesus slept, the first signs of change began to appear. It started subtly, a freshening of the breeze that made the sail suddenly grow taut. The disciples, who were fishermen, exchanged knowing glances. They had felt this shift before. "Perhaps we should wake him," Andrew suggested, looking back at Jesus. "No," Peter replied. "Let him rest. We can handle a bit of wind." But the breeze continued to strengthen, becoming a wind, and then a gale. The surface of the water, which had been as smooth as polished glass, began to roughen. Small wavelets appeared, growing quickly into swells. The boat, which had been gliding peacefully, now began to pitch and roll. The other boats that had been following them were already turning back toward the shore they had left, their occupants clearly visible in the moonlight, faces turned upward at the darkening sky. But Jesus' boat was now nearly in the middle of the lake, equally distant from both shores. Turning back would be as dangerous as continuing forward. Within minutes the wind was howling through the rigging. The sail had to be quickly furled before it could tear or worse overturn the vessel. The disciples moved with the practiced efficiency of men who had faced such conditions before, but even they could not hide their growing concern. The sky, which had been clear and star-filled just moments before, was now obscured by fast-moving clouds that seemed to boil out of nowhere. The moon disappeared behind them, plunging the lake into shadowy darkness, broken only by the white foam of wave caps. Now the boat was being tossed violently. Waves crashed over the bow, sending frigid water cascading into the hull. Several of the men scrambled to bail with whatever containers they could find, while others struggled with the oars, trying to keep the vessel from being broadside to the swells. "This is getting dangerous," James shouted over the roar of the wind. "I've never seen it come up so quickly," his brother John replied, his face glistening with spray. The storm continued to intensify. Lightning now split the darkness, illuminating the scene in stark, terrifying detail. Waves as tall as a man's height, disciples with fear etched across their faces, and still somehow Jesus remained asleep in the stern. Water was coming in faster than they could bail it out. The boat was riding lower in the water, each wave bringing them closer to the point where they would be swamped entirely. Even Peter, who had weathered countless storms on this lake, felt a cold fear gripping his heart. They were in real danger now. The disciples looked at one another, their expressions reflecting a dawning realization. For all their experience, for all their skill, this storm might be beyond their ability to survive. Death felt suddenly uncomfortably close, a cold presence riding the winds that screamed around them. "Where is your faith in these moments?" a quiet voice might have asked, had anyone been listening. But the disciples could hear only the howling wind, the crashing waves, and the hammering of their own frightened hearts. And still, Jesus slept. It was Philip who finally broke. "We need to wake him," he shouted, gesturing wildly toward the stern. The others nodded in agreement, though none could have articulated exactly what they expected Jesus to do. He was no sailor. He had spent his life as a carpenter, not a fisherman. And yet, in their moment of greatest fear, they turned to him instinctively. Peter struggled toward the stern, fighting to keep his balance as the boat heaved beneath him. He reached Jesus and knelt beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. Even in the midst of chaos, Peter couldn't help but marvel. How could anyone sleep through such violence? "Master!" Peter called, having to shout to be heard over the storm. "Master, wake up!" Jesus stirred slightly but did not wake. The boat pitched violently, nearly throwing Peter off his feet. He gripped Jesus' robe more firmly. "Teacher!" This time it was John who'd made his way to join Peter. "Don't you care if we drown?" Those words, spoken from fear rather than faith, seemed to penetrate Jesus' sleep. His eyes opened, taking in the scene around him with calm clarity. The water sloshing in the bottom of the boat, the sail straining against its ties, his friends' faces contorted with fear. There was no disorientation, no moment of confusion or alarm. Jesus simply sat up, his movements unhurried even as the boat threatened to capsize beneath him. Water streamed from his hair and beard. His robe was soaked through. Yet he showed no sign of the terror that had overcome his disciples. What happened next would be burned into the memory of every man present. A moment they would recount countless times in the years to come, a demonstration of power so profound that it would forever alter their understanding of the one they followed. Jesus stood up. In a boat being violently tossed by waves, when standing was nearly impossible, Jesus rose to his feet with perfect balance, as though the deck beneath him were solid ground. He looked out at the churning waters, at the dark sky split by lightning, at the wind that howled like a living thing. And then he spoke. Just 3 words, uttered not in a shout to be heard over the storm, but in a tone of quiet authority, as one who expected to be obeyed. Peace, be still. The Greek words, siopa pefimoso, carried a weight beyond their literal meaning. Silence, be muzzled, as though addressing not unthinking elements, but a creature that could hear and must obey. What happened next defied all natural law, all human experience. The wind ceased, not gradually, not with diminishing gusts that slowly faded away. It simply stopped, as completely as if a door had been closed against it. One moment it howled with deadly force, the next it was gone, and the waves, which should have continued to roll and crash even after the wind died, also subsided immediately. The surface of the lake, which moments before had been a chaotic, foam-streaked nightmare, became as smooth as polished marble. So complete was the transformation that the stars, once again visible in the cleared sky, reflected perfectly in the water's surface, as though the disciples floated in the midst of infinite space. The silence that followed was profound, almost shocking in its completeness. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of small wavelets against the hull and the ragged breathing of the disciples. For a long moment no one spoke. They stared at Jesus, then at the suddenly calm water, then back at Jesus. Their minds struggled to process what they had just witnessed. This was beyond their categories, beyond their understanding of what was possible. It was Jesus who finally broke the silence, his voice gentle yet penetrating in the stillness. He looked at each of his disciples in turn, his gaze both loving and challenging. "Why are you so afraid?" he asked. "Do you still have no faith?" The questions hung in the air, not accusatory but probing, inviting self-examination. Faith. Such a small word for such a profound concept. They had believed in him enough to follow him, to leave their livelihoods behind. They had seen him heal the sick, cast out demons, challenge the religious authorities. They had committed their lives to his cause. But this kind of faith that remained steady when death seemed certain, faith that trusted even when all evidence suggested they were doomed, this was another level entirely. This was faith that could sleep through a storm. The disciples did not answer Jesus' questions. Instead, they posed their own, speaking in hushed, awestruck tones among themselves. "Who is this?" they whispered. "Even the wind and the waves obey him." It was the question that would echo through their hearts for days, weeks, years to come. Who is this man we have chosen to follow? If the forces of nature bend to his will, what might that mean? The implications were staggering, too vast to fully comprehend in that moment of stunned amazement. The boat continued to drift peacefully on the now placid surface of the lake. Above them, the night sky had cleared entirely, revealing a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed close enough to touch. The moon cast its silver light once more, creating a path of a shimmering brightness that stretched toward the eastern shore. Jesus did not press them for answers to his questions. He simply sat back down in the stern, his expression serene. Perhaps he understood that the seed had been planted, a seed of deeper understanding that would take time to germinate and grow. The disciples returned to their positions, taking up oars once more to continue the journey to the other side. But they rowed differently now, their movements careful and reverent, as though the very air around them had become sacred space. Occasionally they would glance at Jesus, then at one another, communicating without words their shared astonishment. As they approached the eastern shore, the first light of dawn began to paint the sky with gentle hues of pink and gold. A new day was beginning, and for the disciples, it would be a day coloured by the extraordinary revelation of the night. They had embarked on this journey as followers of a remarkable teacher, they would disembark with the dawning realization that they were in the presence of someone far greater than they had imagined. The boat's hull scraped gently against the shore. One by one, the disciples stepped out, their feet sinking into the wet sand. Jesus was the last to disembark, moving with the same quiet grace that characterized all his actions. As his foot touched the shore, he paused for a moment, gazing back across the now peaceful waters. Perhaps he was thinking of the lesson his friends had just learned, or perhaps of the greater storms, the deeper challenges that still awaited them all. For this night's tempest, however terrifying, was but a small preview of the forces that would one day rage against him and those who loved him. But those were concerns for another day. For now, Jesus simply turned toward the rising sun and began walking inland, knowing his disciples would follow, and they did, their footsteps in the sand forming a pattern behind his, a visual representation of the faith journey they had embarked upon, still uncertain, but now enriched by a deeper glimpse of the one they followed, the one who could speak to storms and be obeyed. As we rest in the stillness of this moment, let's reflect on what we've just witnessed through the eyes of the disciples. Feel the residual awe that must have lingered in their hearts as they processed what had happened on that lake. The one they thought they knew had revealed himself to be far more powerful, far more majestic than they had imagined. Perhaps you find yourself in a storm right now, not one of wind and waves, but a storm nonetheless. It might be anxiety that crashes over you like relentless waves. It might be uncertainty about the future, rising like dark clouds on the horizon. It might be grief or loneliness or fear, emotions that howl through your heart like a gale-force wind. Take a moment to name your storm silently. What is causing turbulence in your life right now? What makes your heart race with worry or your mind churn with doubt? Pause. Now imagine Jesus in your boat. Yes, right there with you in the midst of your personal tempest. This is not wishful thinking or mere metaphor. It is the profound reality of the Christian faith. Emmanuel, God with us, not God observing from a safe distance, not God waiting for us on the shore after we've weathered the storm alone, but God present in the very midst of our chaos. And here is something remarkable to consider. In the story we've just heard, Jesus didn't calm the storm immediately. First, he slept through it. There's a profound lesson here that's easy to miss. Sometimes the greatest demonstration of faith is not receiving an immediate solution to our problem, but finding peace in the midst of it. Peace so profound it can rest, even when everything around it is in chaos. Jesus sleeping in the storm wasn't indifference. It was a demonstration of absolute trust in the Father. It was a live sermon more powerful than any words he could have spoken. You can rest even when the storms rage, because you know who holds you. Take a deep breath and sit with that thought for a moment. Pause. Now consider the words Jesus spoke to the disciples. Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? These weren't words of condemnation, but an invitation to growth. Jesus was gently showing them the gap between what they professed to believe about him and how they behaved when circumstances became frightening. He was calling them to a faith that remained steady even when situations suggest there's reason to panic. What might Jesus be inviting you to trust him with right now? Where in your life might he be saying, "Peace, be still"? Pause. There's another beautiful detail in this story that's worth lingering over. Jesus said to the disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Not let us go into the middle of the lake and drown. He had already declared the destination before the journey began. Despite the storm that arose, his intention remained unchanged. They were going to reach the other side. In your own life, what other side has Jesus promised you? What word has he spoken over your situation that the current storm seems to contradict? Hold fast to his promise. The storm, no matter how violent, cannot prevent the fulfillment of his declared purpose. When Jesus commands something, whether it's peace, be still, to a raging sea, or let us go to the other side to his disciples, it will come to pass. His word does not return void. It accomplishes what he intends. There's a particular comfort in knowing that the same voice that commanded the elements is spoken over your life. The same authority that subdued the storm is engaged with your circumstances. The same love that prompted Jesus to stand and act on behalf of his frightened friends is extended to you as you navigate your own waters. Listen now for his voice in the quiet of your heart. Perhaps he's not removing your storm immediately. Perhaps, like the disciples, you're being invited to know him more deeply through the experience of watching him work in unexpected ways. But know this, he is in your boat. And because of that, you will reach the shore. Let the gentle rocking of the now calm waters lull you toward rest. Feel the tension leave your body as you entrust yourself to the one who commands the wind and waves. Whatever storms tomorrow may bring, tonight you rest in the presence of the storm calmer, the peace speaker, the Lord of wind and wave. Let these words wash over you like gentle waves. Peace, be still. You are safe in his hands. Let go of your worries. Let him hold them now. Peace, be still. Rest in this truth. If the winds and waves obey him, so can your anxious heart. You don't have to control the storm. You just have to rest with the one who can. As we come to the close of our time together, I want to offer a blessing over you as you prepare for sleep. May you rest tonight in the perfect peace that comes from knowing the master of the storm is watching over you. May you sleep deeply, secure in the knowledge that the same God who calmed the Sea of Galilee is present in your room, attentive to your breathing, mindful of your needs. May your dreams be serene, unthreatened by the storms of waking life. May the gentle rocking of God's love lull you into profound rest, the kind of rest that renews not just the body but the soul. May you awaken tomorrow with the disciples' question still echoing in your heart. Who is this? Even the wind and waves obey him. And may that wonder lead you into a day lived with greater trust and deeper peace. Let us pray. Loving Father, I thank you for the precious soul listening right now. You know their name, their face, their struggles, and their joys. You know the storms they've weathered, and the ones that may still lie ahead. I ask that you would spread your mantle of peace over them tonight. Quiet their racing thoughts, slow their breathing, release the tension from their muscles, guard their mind against anxious ruminations, and fill it instead with the truth of your loving presence. Lord Jesus, just as you stood in authority over the storm on Galilee, I ask you to speak. Peace, be still over any turbulence in their life. Calm the waters of their circumstances. Quiet the winds of their worry. Help them to rest in the boat with you, trusting that you will bring them safely to the other side. Holy Spirit, be the breath of God in this room tonight. Fill this space with your comforting presence. Minister to the deep places of hurt or fear that conscious thought cannot reach. Repair, restore, and renew as only you can do during the sacred hours of sleep. We rest tonight in the perfect love that casts out fear, in the mighty name of Jesus who calms all storms. Amen. Remember, dear friend, Jesus is in your boat. The journey continues tomorrow, but tonight you can sleep in perfect peace. You're watched over. You are loved. You're not alone. Good night, and may God bless your rest. Hello, dear friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin this beautiful journey together, I'd love to connect with you for just a moment. How has your day been? Whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening where you are in the world, I hope this story finds you in a peaceful place, ready to receive some comfort and inspiration. No matter what corner of the globe you're listening from, you're part of our Sacred Slumber family. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber for more stories like this one that will nourish your soul and bring peace to your heart. Tonight, we're going to journey together through one of the most remarkable stories ever told, the true account of Joseph, a young man whose life teaches us profound lessons about resilience, faith, and the mysterious ways that purpose unfolds even in our darkest moments. This is a story that has inspired millions across centuries, reminding us that no matter how deep our pit may seem, there's always hope for palace moments ahead. In the ancient land of Canaan, where the sun painted golden hues across rolling hills dotted with olive trees and grazing flocks, there lived a patriarch named Jacob. His tents were pitched near Hebron, and his wealth was measured not in gold or silver, but in the size of his herds and the strength of his family. Jacob had 12 sons, but among them all one held a special place in his father's heart. Joseph was 17 years old, with eyes that sparkled with intelligence and a spirit that seemed to dance with dreams. He was the son of Rachel, Jacob's but loved wife, who had died giving birth to Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother. Perhaps it was the memory of Rachel that made Jacob's love for Joseph burn so brightly. Or perhaps it was something else. A recognition of the extraordinary destiny that seemed to hover around this particular son like morning mist around a mountain peak. The favouritism was evident to everyone in the household. While Joseph's older brothers, Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar and Zebulun worked hard in the fields tending the flocks, Joseph often remained close to home. His brothers wore the simple, practical garments of shepherds, but Joseph wore something entirely different. One day Jacob called Joseph to his tent. The old man's hands, weathered by years of labour and life, held a garment that took Joseph's breath away. It was a coat of many colours, rich blues like the depths of the sea, vibrant reds like the sunset over the desert, brilliant yellows like fields of grain, and deep purples like the robes of kings. The fabric was fine, the workmanship exquisite. It was not the coat of a shepherd, but the robe of a prince. "My son," Jacob said, his voice thick with emotion as he placed the coat on Joseph's shoulders, "this is for you. You are precious to me beyond measure." Joseph felt the weight of the coat, but more than that, he felt the weight of his father's love and the unspoken promise it contained. As he walked among his brothers wearing this magnificent garment, he could feel their eyes following him, eyes that had grown cold with resentment and hard with jealousy. But the coat was only the beginning. Joseph had always been a dreamer, but now his dreams took on a quality that was both wonderful and troubling. One morning, as the family gathered for their meal, Joseph could no longer contain the vision that had visited him in the night. "Listen to this dream I had," Joseph said, his voice bright with excitement and innocence. "We were binding sheaves of grain out in the field, when suddenly my sheaf rose and stood upright, while your sheaves gathered around mine and bowed down to it." The silence that followed was deafening. His brothers exchanged glances that spoke volumes. Reuben's jaw tightened. Simeon's hands clenched into fists. Judah shook his head in disgust. "Do you intend to reign over us?" Simeon asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Will you actually rule us?" But Joseph, in his youthful enthusiasm, seemed oblivious to the storm clouds gathering around him. Soon after he had another dream, even more vivid than the first. "Listen," he said one evening as the family sat around the fire, the flames casting dancing shadows on their faces. "I had another dream, and this time the sun and moon and 11 stars were bowing down to me." Even Jacob was troubled by this dream. "What is this dream you had?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of concern. "Will your mother and I and your brothers actually come and bow down to the ground before you?" Though Jacob rebuked Joseph publicly, privately he pondered these words in his heart. There was something about his son's dreams that felt different from ordinary night visions. They carried the weight of prophecy, the sense of divine purpose. But for Joseph's brothers, these dreams were the final straw. Their hatred for Joseph grew like a cancer, fed by jealousy and watered by resentment. The brothers could hardly speak a civil word to Joseph anymore. When he approached, conversation stopped. When he tried to join their work, they found reasons to send him away. The coat of many colours became a symbol of everything they despised about their father's favouritism and their brother's apparent arrogance. One day, Jacob sent Joseph to check on his brothers who were grazing the flocks near Dothan, several days' journey from home. As Joseph set out, wearing his beautiful coat and carrying provisions for his brothers, he had no idea that he was walking toward a destiny that would change not only his life, but the course of history itself. The brothers saw him coming from a long distance, the colours of his coat visible even across the rolling hills. As that familiar figure approached, the resentment that had been building for years finally reached its boiling point. "Here comes that dreamer," one of them said with venom. "Let's kill him," another suggested. "We can throw him into one of these cisterns and say that a ferocious animal devoured him. Then we'll see what comes of his dreams." For a moment, murder hung in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. But Reuben, the eldest, felt the weight of responsibility on his shoulders. "Let's not take his life," he said quickly. "Throw him into this cistern here in the wilderness, but don't lay a hand on him." Privately, Reuben planned to rescue Joseph later and return him to their father. When Joseph finally reached his brothers, he greeted them with a smile, completely unaware of the dark thoughts that had been brewing in their hearts. But instead of the warm welcome he expected, they seized him roughly. Hands that should have embraced him tore at his beautiful coat, stripping it from his body. Before he could fully comprehend what was happening, they had grabbed him and thrown him into an empty cistern. The pit was deep and dry, its walls smooth stone that offered no hope of escape. As Joseph hit the bottom, the breath knocked from his lungs. He looked up to see the circle of sky above growing smaller as his brothers walked away. The silence was overwhelming. One moment he had been walking free under the open sky, and the next he was trapped in a hole in the ground, abandoned by his own family. Above him, his brothers sat down to eat their meal as if nothing had happened. The casual way they consumed their bread and cheese while their brother suffered below spoke volumes about how completely their hearts had been hardened by jealousy. But God's purposes are rarely thwarted by human cruelty. And even as Joseph sat in that pit, wondering if he would die there, divine providence was already at work. In the distance, a caravan of Ishmaelite traders appeared on the horizon, their camels loaded with spices, balm and myrrh bound for Egypt. Judah, perhaps feeling some stirring of conscience, looked at his brothers and said, "What will we gain if we kill our brother and cover up his blood? Come, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites and not lay our hands on him. After all, he is our brother, our own flesh and blood." The brothers agreed, seeing an opportunity to rid themselves of Joseph while making a profit. They pulled Joseph out of the cistern and sold him to the traders for 20 shekels of silver. As the caravan disappeared into the distance with Joseph bound among the slaves, the brothers took his coat of many colours and tore it. Then they killed a goat and dipped the coat in its blood. When they returned home, they presented the bloodied coat to their father. "We found this," they said. "Examine it to see whether it is your son's robe." Jacob recognized it immediately. The colours that had once brought him such joy now brought only anguish. "It is my son's robe," he cried. "Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Jacob tore his clothes in grief and put on sackcloth. He mourned for his son many days, and though all his sons and daughters came to comfort him, he refused to be comforted. "No," he said, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." Meanwhile, the caravan carrying Joseph continued its journey toward Egypt, each step taking him further from everything he had ever known and loved. As the young man looked back at the fading hills of his homeland, he could not have imagined that this betrayal, this moment that felt like the end of everything, was actually the beginning of a story that would demonstrate the power of God to bring beauty from ashes and purpose from pain. The journey to Egypt was long and grueling. Joseph, who had never known anything but comfort and privilege, now found himself chained among slaves, his feet bloody from walking across rough terrain, his throat parched from the desert sun. The traders were not cruel, but neither were they kind. He was simply merchandise to them, a commodity to be delivered in good condition to fetch the best price. As the caravan crested the final hill before entering Egypt, Joseph's eyes widened at the sight before him. Egypt was unlike anything he had ever seen. The Nile River stretched like a blue ribbon through the landscape, its banks lined with lush green vegetation that stood in stark contrast to the golden desert beyond. Pyramids rose majestically in the distance, monuments to the power and sophistication of this ancient civilization. The cities teemed with activity, merchants hawking their wares, craftsmen plying their trades, and everywhere the bustle of a society that had mastered the art of turning the desert into a garden. In the slave market of Memphis, Joseph stood with the others as potential buyers examined them like livestock. His youth and obvious intelligence caught the eye of several bidders, but it was Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and captain of the guard, who ultimately purchased him. Potiphar was a man of considerable wealth and influence, with a household that required numerous servants to maintain its operations. Joseph's new life began in Potiphar's house, where he was assigned to work among the other servants. Everything about his circumstances had changed. He who had once worn a coat of many colours now dressed in the simple linen of a slave. He who had once been served was now serving others. He who had once been the favoured son was now property, with no rights and no freedom. But something remarkable happened in Potiphar's house. Instead of becoming bitter or despondent, Joseph chose to serve with excellence. When he was given a task, he completed it better than anyone expected. When he was assigned to care for something, he treated it as if it were his own. His attitude was not that of a man who'd been wronged, but of someone who understood that his character was more important than his circumstances. It didn't take long for Potiphar to notice this exceptional young man. While other servants did only what was required of them, Joseph anticipated needs before they were expressed. He learned the Egyptian language with remarkable speed, mastered the customs of the household, and demonstrated an administrative ability that was far beyond his years. Most importantly, there was something about Joseph's presence that seemed to bring blessing wherever he went. Potiphar began to entrust Joseph with greater responsibilities. First, he made him his personal attendant. Then he put him in charge of his household affairs. Before long, Joseph was managing all of Potiphar's possessions, his property, his servants, his business dealings. The Egyptian captain of the guard had never seen anything like it. Everything that Joseph touched seemed to prosper. Years passed, and Joseph grew from a teenager into a handsome young man. The hardships he had endured had not broken him, but had instead forged him into someone of remarkable character and capability. Potiphar trusted him completely, to the point where he concerned himself with nothing except the food he ate. Everything else was in Joseph's capable hands. But success and favour can sometimes bring their own dangers, and Joseph was about to face a test that would prove even more challenging than the pit his brothers had thrown him into. Potiphar's wife had noticed the young Hebrew slave who had risen to such prominence in her household. Joseph was not only capable and trustworthy, but he had grown into a man of striking appearance. Day after day she watched him as he went about his duties with quiet dignity and remarkable competence. Soon, watching was not enough. "Come to bed with me," she said to Joseph one day when they found themselves alone. Joseph was stunned by her proposition. The wife of his master, a woman of rank and privilege, was propositioning a slave. But Joseph's response revealed the depth of his character and the strength of his convictions. "No," he said firmly but respectfully. "With me in charge, my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he has entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God?" Day after day she spoke to Joseph, but he refused to go to bed with her or even to be with her. Joseph understood that betraying Potiphar's trust would not only be wrong, but it would also be a sin against the God who had been with him through all his trials. His integrity was not for sale, regardless of the price or the pressure. But a person determined to do wrong will often become vindictive when their advances are rejected. Potiphar's wife's desire turned to anger, and her anger to a determination for revenge. She waited for the right opportunity, and one day when Joseph came into the house to attend to his duties, and none of the household servants were inside, she made her move. She caught him by his cloak and said, "Come to bed with me." But Joseph left his cloak in her hand and ran out of the house. Holding his cloak as evidence, Potiphar's wife called to the household servants. "Look," she said, This Hebrew has been brought to us to make sport of us. He came in here to sleep with me, but I screamed. When he heard me scream for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. When Potiphar came home, his wife told him the same story. That Hebrew slave you brought us came to me to make sport of me, but as soon as I screamed for help, he left his cloak beside me and ran out of the house. Potiphar burned with anger. The man he had trusted above all others, the servant who had brought such blessing to his household, had apparently betrayed that trust in the worst possible way. Without investigation, without hearing Joseph's side of the story, Potiphar had Joseph seized and thrown into prison, the same prison where the king's prisoners were confined. Once again, Joseph found himself in a pit, though this time it was made of stone and iron rather than earth. Once again, he had been betrayed by those he had served faithfully. Once again, his circumstances had changed dramatically through no fault of his own. He had done the right thing, had maintained his integrity, had honoured God, and his reward was imprisonment for a crime he had not committed. Many people would have become bitter at this point. They would have questioned why God allowed such injustice, why faithfulness seemed to be rewarded with suffering. They might have decided that integrity was not worth the cost, that doing right was foolish when it led to such consequences. But Joseph was not like most people. Even in prison, even after being falsely accused and unjustly punished, something within him refused to give up hope. He had learned that his circumstances did not define him, his character did. He had discovered that God's presence was not dependent on favourable conditions, but was available even in the darkest places. And remarkably, even in prison, Joseph began to prosper. The warden noticed this unusual prisoner who carried himself with such dignity, who treated others with such respect, who seemed to bring order and blessing wherever he went. Before long, the warden put Joseph in charge of all the other prisoners and made him responsible for all that was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything under Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and gave him success in whatever he did. Once again, Joseph had taken a situation that seemed hopeless and had found a way to serve with excellence, to lead with integrity, and to trust that somehow, in ways he could not yet see, God was working all things together for good. But the greatest tests of Joseph's faith were still ahead, and the prison that seemed like an ending was actually preparing him for a beginning that would astonish the world. Prison has a way of stripping away everything except what truly matters. In the Egyptian jail where Joseph now found himself, surrounded by stone walls and iron bars, the external trappings of success and status meant nothing. Here, in this place reserved for those who had supposedly committed crimes against Pharaoh, Joseph faced the ultimate test of his character. Days turned into months, and months into years. Joseph had now spent more time as a slave and prisoner than he had as the favoured son in his father's house. The dreams of his youth, the sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage, seemed like the fantasies of another lifetime. If someone had asked him during those long, dark nights whether he still believed in those dreams, he might have wondered himself. But Joseph had learned something profound during his years of hardship, that faith is not about understanding God's timeline, but about trusting God's character. He had seen evidence of divine favour even in the darkest circumstances. When he was in Potiphar's house, God had blessed his work. Now, even in prison, he could see the same pattern. Blessing flowing through him to benefit others. Success following him, even in the most unlikely places. The other prisoners noticed something different about Joseph. While many of them spent their time in despair, anger, or plotting revenge, Joseph maintained a remarkable sense of peace. He listened to their stories with compassion, helped resolve disputes with wisdom, and carried himself with a dignity that prison walls could not diminish. The warden had made him the unofficial leader among the prisoners, and everyone, guards and inmates alike, respected him. One morning, Joseph noticed that two of his fellow prisoners seemed particularly troubled. They were not ordinary criminals, but former members of Pharaoh's household, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker. Both had been imprisoned for offences against their royal master, and both carried themselves with the dignity of men, accustomed to positions of privilege and responsibility. "Why do you look so sad today?" Joseph asked them. The cupbearer answered, "We both had dreams, but there is no one to interpret them." In the ancient world, dreams were considered messages from the gods, and their interpretation was a specialized skill typically reserved for trained priests and wise men. To have a significant dream and no way to understand its meaning was a source of genuine distress. Joseph's response revealed both his humility and his faith. "Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell me your dreams." The chief cupbearer went first. "In my dream," he said, "I saw a vine in front of me, and on the vine were 3 branches. As soon as it budded, it blossomed, and its clusters ripened into grapes. Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes, squeezed them into Pharaoh's cup, and put the cup in his hand." Joseph listened carefully, and as the cupbearer spoke, understanding came to him with a clarity that felt like sunrise after a long night. "This is what it means," Joseph said. "The 3 branches are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your position, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand, just as you used to do when you were his cupbearer." The cupbearer's face lit up with hope. Joseph continued, "But when all goes well with you, remember me and show me kindness. Mention me to Pharaoh and get me out of this prison. I was forcibly carried off from the land of the Hebrews, and even here I have done nothing to deserve being put in a dungeon." When the chief baker saw that Joseph had given a favourable interpretation to the cupbearer's dream, he eagerly shared his own vision. "I too had a dream," he said. "On my head were 3 baskets of bread. In the top basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, but the birds were eating them out of the basket on my head." Joseph's expression grew grave as he received understanding of this dream as well. The interpretation was not pleasant, but Joseph knew he had to speak the truth. "This is what it means," he said gently. "The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days, Pharaoh will lift off your head and impale your body on a pole, and the birds will eat away your flesh." 3 days later, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position, so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he impaled the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation. The accuracy of Joseph's interpretation should have marked him as a man of extraordinary ability, someone worthy of attention and favour. The chief cupbearer had been restored to his position of influence, with direct access to the most powerful man in Egypt. Surely he would remember the prisoner who had correctly interpreted his dream and had specifically asked to be remembered. But the chief cupbearer forgot about Joseph. This forgetting was perhaps one of the most difficult trials Joseph had yet faced. It was not the active betrayal of his brothers or the false accusation of Potiphar's wife, but the passive neglect of someone who simply failed to keep his word. Day after day, Joseph waited, hoping that this would be the day when guards would come to release him, when word would arrive that Pharaoh wanted to see him. But the days passed in silence. Months turned into a year, and then another year. 2 full years passed, and still the cupbearer, busy with his restored duties and privileges, did not remember the Hebrew slave who had correctly interpreted his dream. It was as if Joseph had been forgotten not just by one man, but by the entire world. During these 2 years of waiting, Joseph could have become bitter. He could have concluded that helping others was pointless, that kindness was wasted on those who would not return it. He could have decided that his gift for interpreting dreams was worthless if it could not even secure his own freedom. Many people would have given up hope entirely. But Joseph continued to trust, continued to serve, continued to maintain his character even when it seemed to bring no reward. He understood something that many people never learn, that our calling is to be faithful, not to control outcomes. His job was to use his gifts with integrity and kindness. God's job was to handle the timing and the results. In the darkness of those 2 forgotten years, Joseph's faith was refined like gold in a furnace. The dreams of his youth were still alive within him, but they had been purified of any pride or presumption. He was learning that God's promises are always fulfilled, but rarely on our timeline or in the way we expect. And unbeknownst to Joseph, his time of preparation was nearly complete. All the lessons he had learned about integrity under pressure, about leadership in difficult circumstances, about maintaining faith when it seemed unrewarded, were about to be put to their ultimate test. The pit had prepared him for the palace, but first he would need to prove that he was ready for both the privilege and the responsibility that awaited him. The stage was being set for one of the most dramatic turnarounds in human history, and the forgotten prisoner was about to become the second most powerful man in the greatest empire on earth. Pharaoh stood on the balcony of his palace, looking out over the magnificent kingdom that stretched as far as the eye could see. The Nile flowed majestically past the royal residence, its waters reflecting the first light of dawn. Egypt was at the height of its power and prosperity, with abundant harvests, thriving trade, and monuments that would stand for millennia as testaments to its greatness. But on this particular morning, Pharaoh was deeply troubled. For 2 nights in a row, he had been visited by dreams so vivid and disturbing that they left him unable to rest. These were not ordinary dreams. They carried the weight of divine communication, the sense that the gods were trying to tell him something of vital importance. But what? The first dream had been strange and unsettling. Pharaoh had dreamed he was standing by the Nile when 7 cows, fat and sleek, came up out of the river and began grazing among the reeds. Then 7 other cows came up out of the river after them, but these were ugly and gaunt, more wasted and emaciated than any cattle Pharaoh had ever seen in all of Egypt. The ugly, gaunt cows ate up the 7 fat, sleek cows, but even after eating them they looked just as ugly and gaunt as before. The second dream was equally mysterious. This time Pharaoh saw 7 heads of grain growing on a single stalk, healthy and good. Then 7 other heads sprouted after them, but these were thin and scorched by the east wind. The thin heads of grain swallowed up the 7 healthy full heads. Pharaoh woke from each dream with a sense of foreboding that he could not shake. These dreams meant something, but what? He immediately called for all the magicians and wise men of Egypt, men who were trained in the ancient arts of dream interpretation and divine communication. They came quickly at their king's summons, eager to demonstrate their wisdom and earn royal favour. But as Pharaoh recounted his dreams to them, something unprecedented happened. These men, who had built their reputations on their ability to interpret dreams and divine the will of the gods, were completely baffled. They offered various theories and possibilities, but none of them carried the ring of truth. Pharaoh could sense their uncertainty, their fumbling attempts to provide answers they simply did not have. It was in this moment of royal frustration and growing anxiety that the chief cupbearer suddenly remembered something, or rather someone, he had forgotten for 2 long years. "Today I'm reminded of my shortcomings," the cupbearer said, approaching Pharaoh with obvious embarrassment. "Pharaoh was once angry with his servants, and he imprisoned me and the chief baker in the house of the captain of the guard. Each of us had a dream the same night, and each dream had a meaning of its own. Now a young Hebrew was there with us, a servant of the captain of the guard. We told him our dreams, and he interpreted them for us, giving each man the interpretation of his dream, and things turned out exactly as he interpreted them to us. I was restored to my position, and the other man was impaled." Pharaoh's eyes sharpened with interest. A Hebrew slave who could interpret dreams with perfect accuracy, when his own wise men were stumped. "Send for him immediately," Pharaoh commanded. Guards rushed to the prison and found Joseph. "Pharaoh wants to see you," they announced. "Quickly, make yourself presentable." Joseph could hardly believe what he was hearing. After more than a decade in Egypt, first as a slave, then as a prisoner, he was suddenly being summoned to appear before the most powerful man on earth. He shaved, changed his clothes, and tried to prepare himself mentally for whatever was about to happen. As Joseph was led into the royal presence, he could not help but be awed by the magnificence that surrounded him. The palace was a testament to Egypt's wealth and sophistication, with soaring columns, intricate carvings, and precious metals gleaming everywhere. Pharaoh himself sat on a throne that seemed to embody the power and mystery of the gods, dressed in robes that spoke of unimaginable authority. "I had a dream," Pharaoh said without preamble, "and no one can interpret it. But I have heard it said of you that when you hear a dream you can interpret it." Joseph's response revealed the humility and faith that had sustained him through all his trials. "I cannot do it," Joseph replied, "but God will give Pharaoh the answer he desires." This was a remarkable statement for several reasons. First, Joseph gave no credit to himself, acknowledging that any ability he had came from God. Second, he was confident that God would provide the interpretation, even though he had not yet heard the dreams. Third, he was willing to stand before the most powerful man on earth and speak about his Hebrew God, a courageous act that could have had serious consequences if Pharaoh had taken offense. Pharaoh proceeded to tell Joseph both of his dreams in detail, describing the fat and gaunt cows, the healthy and withered grain. As he spoke, Joseph listened with the same careful attention he had given to the dreams of his fellow prisoners years earlier. When Pharaoh finished, Joseph spoke with clarity and confidence that amazed everyone present. "The dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same," he said. "God has revealed to Pharaoh what he's about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterward are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine." Joseph continued, his voice carrying the authority of divine revelation. "It is just as I said to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming throughout the land of Egypt, but 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance in Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance in the land will not be remembered, because the famine that follows it will be so severe. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it soon." But Joseph did not stop with the interpretation. Drawing on his years of experience in administration and his natural wisdom, he offered practical advice for dealing with the crisis that was coming. "And now let Pharaoh look for a discerning and wise man and put him in charge of the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh appoint commissioners over the land to take 1/5 of the harvest of Egypt during the 7 years of abundance. They should collect all the food of these good years that are coming and store up the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, to be kept in the cities for food. This food should be held in reserve for the country, to be used during the 7 years of famine that will come upon Egypt, so that the country may not be ruined by the famine." The plan was brilliant in its simplicity and scope. During the 7 years of abundance, Egypt would systematically store 1/5 of each harvest. This would require massive organisational skills, enormous storage facilities, and careful distribution networks. It would be one of the most ambitious administrative undertakings in human history. Pharaoh and his officials were amazed not only by the interpretation, which had the unmistakable ring of truth, but also by the comprehensive plan Joseph had outlined. Here was a man who could not only understand divine communication, but could also translate that understanding into practical action. "Can we find anyone like this man?" Pharaoh asked his officials. "One in whom is the Spirit of God?" Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, "Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you." And so, in a single day, Joseph went from being a forgotten prisoner to being the 2nd most powerful man in Egypt. Pharaoh took his signet ring from his finger and put it on Joseph's finger. He dressed him in robes of fine linen and put a gold chain around his neck. He had him ride in a chariot as his second in command, and people shouted before him, "Make way!" Pharaoh also gave Joseph an Egyptian name, Zaphenath-Paneah, and gave him Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, to be his wife. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. 13 years had passed since his brothers had thrown him into that pit in Dothan. 13 years of slavery, false accusation, imprisonment, and being forgotten. But now those years of preparation were revealed as exactly that. Preparation for a responsibility that would affect not just Egypt, but the entire known world. As Joseph began his new role, organising the massive project of storing grain for the coming famine, he could not help but remember the dreams of his youth. The sheaves bowing down, the sun and moon and stars paying homage. Those dreams had seemed so impossible during the dark years of his trials, but now he was beginning to see how God had been weaving a story of redemption that was far grander than anything he could have imagined as a 17-year-old boy in his father's house. The 7 years of abundance began exactly as Joseph had predicted, and Egypt's harvests were more bountiful than anyone could remember. Under Joseph's careful supervision, vast storehouses were built in every city, and grain was collected and preserved on an unprecedented scale. The administrative system he designed was so efficient and comprehensive that it became a model for future generations. During this time, Joseph and his wife Asenath were blessed with 2 sons. He named the first Manasseh, saying, "It is because God has made me forget all my trouble and all my father's household." The second son he named Ephraim, saying, "It is because God has made me fruitful in the land of my suffering." These names revealed Joseph's heart. He was grateful for the blessing of forgetting the pain of his past, but he also recognized that God had made him fruitful precisely in the place where he had suffered most. His trials had not been meaningless. They had been the very soil in which his greatest purpose had grown. As the 7 years of abundance came to an end and the 7 years of famine began, Joseph's careful preparations proved their worth. While neighbouring countries struggled with crop failures and starvation, Egypt had grain in abundance. People came from all over the known world to buy food from Joseph, and Egypt became the lifeline for countless nations. The famine was severe throughout the world, and it reached even into the land of Canaan where Jacob lived with his family. When Jacob learned that there was grain in Egypt, he said to his sons, "Why do you just keep looking at each other? I have heard that there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us so that we may live and not die." So 10 of Joseph's brothers went down to buy grain from Egypt. But Jacob did not send Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, with the others because he feared that harm might come to him. Benjamin was now the only remaining son of his beloved Rachel, and Jacob could not bear the thought of losing him too. When Joseph's brothers arrived in Egypt and came before him to buy grain, they bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Joseph recognized them immediately, but they did not recognize him. Here was the fulfillment of his boyhood dreams, his brothers bowing before him, but it came not with triumph, but with the weight of enormous responsibility. Joseph remembered his dreams about them, but he pretended to be a stranger and spoke harshly to them. "Where do you come from?" he demanded. "From the land of Canaan," they replied, "to buy food." Joseph accused them of being spies, testing them to see what kind of men they had become. Through a series of encounters, he kept Simeon as a prisoner and demanded that they bring Benjamin to prove their honesty. When they returned with Benjamin, Joseph's emotions nearly overwhelmed him, but he continued to test them. The final test came when Joseph had his silver cup planted in Benjamin's sack, then accused him of theft. When the cup was found, Joseph declared that Benjamin would become his slave. It was then that Judah, the same brother who had suggested selling Joseph years before, stepped forward and offered to take Benjamin's place as a slave, saying he could not bear to see his father's grief if Benjamin did not return. This act of selfless love broke Joseph's heart. His brothers had changed. The jealous, cruel men who had thrown him into a pit were now willing to sacrifice themselves for each other and for their father's happiness. Joseph could no longer control himself. He sent all his attendants away and revealed himself to his brothers. "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" he said, weeping so loudly that the Egyptians heard him. His brothers were terrified, but Joseph reassured them, "Come close to me. I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no ploughing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God." This was the heart of Joseph's story, not revenge, but redemption, not bitterness, but blessing. He had learned to see God's hand even in the betrayal and suffering he had endured. "You intended to harm me," he would later tell them, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Joseph brought his entire family to Egypt, where they were given the best land in Goshen. Jacob, who had mourned Joseph as dead for over 20 years, was reunited with his beloved son. The family was restored, the famine was survived, and the promises God had made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob continued to unfold through their descendants. When Jacob died years later, Joseph's brothers feared that he might finally take revenge on them. But Joseph wept and said, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." Joseph lived to be 110 years old, seeing his family multiply and prosper in Egypt. Before he died, he made his brothers promise that when God eventually led them back to the Promised Land, they would carry his bones with them. Even in death, Joseph's faith looked forward to the fulfillment of God's promises. Joseph's story teaches us that God can use even the worst circumstances to accomplish his greatest purposes. The pit prepared Joseph for the palace, but more importantly, it prepared his heart for forgiveness. His sufferings were not meaningless. They were the very experiences that shaped him into a man capable of saving nations and reconciling families. In our own lives, we may face betrayal, false accusations, forgotten promises, and years of waiting that seem endless. But Joseph's story reminds us that God is always working, even when we cannot see his hand. Our calling is not to understand his timeline, but to trust his character and remain faithful in whatever circumstances we find ourselves. The dreams God gives us may take decades to fulfill, and they may come to pass in ways we never expected. But his promises are sure, his purposes are good, and his love never fails. From the pit to the palace, from slavery to salvation, from betrayal to blessing, this is the pattern of redemption that runs through Joseph's story, and through our own lives when we place our trust in the God who makes all things work together for good. Rest well tonight, dear friends of sacred slumber, knowing that your story too is being written by a loving God who specializes in turning mourning into dancing, ashes into beauty, and the deepest valleys into the highest mountains of purpose and joy. Sweet dreams, and may you find peace in knowing that no matter what pit you may find yourself in today, God is already preparing your palace for tomorrow.